In the shadows of New York City, where loyalty is bought with blood and broken with a whisper, one man rose to become the most powerful mob boss in America, only to do something no godfather had ever done before. This is the story of Joseph Massino, the man who broke. Before we dive into the incredible journey of the last godfather, I want to know, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know if you're listening from New York, Los Angeles, London, or somewhere across the globe. And if you're settling in for this full story, hit that subscribe button and the like button. It helps us bring you more true crime stories from the underworld. Picture this, a cold morning in January 2005. Inside a federal prison, a 61-year-old man sits across from FBI agents, preparing to shatter a code that had stood for over a century. His hands, which had orchestrated murders and built an empire, now held a pen that would sign away everything the Mafia stood for. Joseph Massino, boss of the Bonanno crime family, was about to become something unprecedented in the annals of organized crime, the first sitting boss of a New York family to turn government informant. But to understand how a man could rise to such power only to betray everything he'd built, we must travel back in time to the streets of Queens, to a world where the American dream wore a darker face, where opportunity meant something very different from what the founding fathers had imagined. Now let's go back to where it all began. The year was 1943. World War II raged across Europe and the Pacific. American soldiers fought for democracy abroad, while in the working-class neighborhoods of New York City, a different kind of struggle played out on streets where survival often meant choosing between legitimate poverty and illegitimate prosperity. On January 10th, in the Maspeth section of Queens, Josephine and Anthony Massino welcomed their son into the world. They named him Joseph Charles Massino, never imagining that this child would one day command one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. Maspeth in the 1940s and 50s was a tapestry of contradictions. Italian-American families lived alongside Irish, Polish, and Jewish immigrants, creating a diverse but insular community. The neighborhood was defined by its industrial landscape, factories, warehouses, and railroad yards that promised honest work to those willing to break their backs for it. But beneath this veneer of working-class respectability, another economy thrived in the shadows. The Massino family was not connected to organized crime. Anthony Massino worked hard, providing for his family through legitimate means. Young Joseph attended local schools, played in the streets with other neighborhood children, and seemed destined for an ordinary life. But Queens in those years was a proving ground for the Mafia. The five families Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno had divided New York like feudal lords carving up territory, and their influence touched everything. Joseph was not a particularly good student. He found the classroom stifling, the lessons irrelevant to the world he saw around him. By his sophomore year of high school, he made a decision that would set the course of his life. He dropped out. In another era, in another place, this might have been a tragedy. But on the streets of Queens, formal education seemed less valuable than street smarts. And the young men who truly succeeded in the neighborhood often didn't have diplomas. His first jobs were legitimate, working in the warehouses and trucking companies that dominated the industrial landscape. But Joseph Massino was observant. He watched how goods moved through the city, how trucks carried valuable cargo, how security was often lax. More importantly, he watched the men who seemed to have money, respect, and power without the backbreaking labor his father endured. These men dressed better, drove better cars, and commanded fear and admiration in equal measure. The line between legitimate work and criminal enterprise was thinner than most people realized. Especially in the trucking industry, hijacking was a growth business in the 1960s. A well-executed truck hijacking could net thousands of dollars in a single night. more than months of honest labor. The risk was considerable, but to a young man with ambition and no better prospects, the mathematics were compelling. The late 1960s marked Joseph Massino's true education. If high school had failed to capture his interest, the streets provided a curriculum perfectly suited to his talents. He began with small-time theft, learning the craft of hijacking from men who'd perfected it into an art form. The trick wasn't just in the theft, it was in the planning, the execution, and most importantly, the disposal of stolen goods. Massino proved to be a natural. He was methodical, careful, and possessed a quality that would serve him throughout his criminal career: patience. Unlike other young thieves who burned hot and fast, making reckless moves that landed them in prison or worse, Massino thought before he acted. He built networks, cultivated relationships with fences who could move stolen merchandise, and most crucially, he learned when to strike and when to hold back. His body type earned him various nicknames in the neighborhood. Some called him Big Joey for his substantial build. Others called him the Ear for his notably large ears, a nickname he detested but couldn't escape. But it was his reputation for competence that truly defined him. In a world where men disappeared for making mistakes, reliability was the most valuable currency. It was during this period that Massino caught the attention of Philip "Rusty" Rastelli, a captain in the Bonanno crime family. Rastelli was a traditionalist, a man who valued the old ways, respect, hierarchy, and proving oneself through action rather than words. He saw something in the young hijacker from Mospeth, a quality that transcended mere criminal competence. Massino understood the unwritten rules. He knew when to speak and when to stay silent. He showed respect to his superiors without being obsequious. Most importantly, he demonstrated that rarest of qualities in the criminal underworld: trustworthiness. The relationship between Rastelli and Massino was more than mentor and student. In the Mafia, such bonds often superseded blood relationships. Rastelli became Massino's patron, his guide through the labyrinthine politics of La Cosa Nostra. Through Rastelli, Massino met the men who truly ran New York, made members of the Bonanno family, soldiers and capos who moved through the city like sharks through dark water. The Bonanno family in the late 1960s was powerful but troubled. Internal conflicts and law enforcement pressure created constant instability. Leadership changed, alliances shifted, and men who seemed untouchable one day were dead or imprisoned the next. For an ambitious young criminal like Massino, this chaos presented both danger and opportunity. The old order was crumbling, and new men would rise to take their place. But rising in the Mafia required more than ambition and competence. It required a willingness to cross a line that separated ordinary criminals from true members of La Cosa Nostra. It required the willingness to kill. The year 1975 marked a turning point in Joseph Massino's transformation from successful criminal to made member of the Mafia. The catalyst was a man named Vito Borelli, whose death would serve as Massino's audition for membership in La Cosa Nostra. The details of why Borelli had to die were less important than the function his murder would serve. In the Mafia, killing isn't merely about eliminating threats or competition. It's a ritual, a test, and a bond. When you kill for the family, you prove your commitment. You demonstrate that you value the organization above law, above conventional morality, above your own safety. More importantly, you bind yourself to your accomplices through shared guilt. Blood is the strongest bond in the underworld, stronger than marriage, stronger than friendship, stronger even than family. Massino participated in Borelli's murder alongside Salvatore good-looking Sal Vitali. His brother-in-law, Vitali, had married Massino's sister, Josephine, and the two men had grown close. Now they would be bound by something deeper than marriage. They would share the secret of murder. The hit itself was unremarkable in its execution, but profound in its implications. Borelli was lured to his death. Killed and disposed of, no witnesses, no evidence. No complications for Massino and Vitali. The murder proved they could be trusted with the family's most serious business. They could kill cleanly, and more importantly, they could stay silent afterward, in the days and weeks following the murder. As investigators searched for answers and Borelli's family mourned, Massino and Vitali went about their lives as if nothing had happened. This ability to compartmentalize, to live with violence without letting it show, was essential to survival in their world. The Bonanno leadership took notice. Massino had passed the test. He'd proven himself not just as a money earner, but as a soldier in the true sense of the word, someone who could be called upon to commit violence when necessary and live with the consequences without breaking. 2 years later, in 1977, Joseph Massino was formally inducted into the Bonanno crime family as a made member of La Cosa Nostra. The ceremony was ancient, unchanged in its essentials for generations. Massino stood before senior members of the family. His hand was pricked until blood flowed. In some versions of the ceremony, a saint's card was burned in his hand. The symbolism was clear. "Let my flesh burn like this saint if I betray the family." The words of the oath, passed down through generations, were spoken. The code of silence, the foundational principle of La Cosa Nostra. No matter what happened, no matter the pressure, no matter the consequences, a made member never cooperated with law enforcement. Death before dishonor, prison before betrayal. This was the code that had protected the Mafia for generations. The wall of silence that law enforcement had struggled for decades to penetrate. Joseph Massino, at 34 years old, had achieved what many criminals only dreamed of. He was now a made member of one of New York's 5 families. He had protection, status, and opportunity. He was also bound by chains stronger than any prison, the chains of Omertà, the code he would carry for over a quarter century before finally, catastrophically, breaking it by the late 1970s. The Bonanno family faced a crisis that would reshape its future and create the conditions for Joseph Massino's eventual rise to power. At the center of this crisis was Carmine Galante, a man whose ambition and brutality would ultimately cost him his life. Galante, known by the nickname Lilo, slang for cigar, which he constantly smoked, was a throwback to an earlier, more violent era of organized crime. He'd risen through the ranks through sheer ruthlessness. And by the late 1970s, with Philip Rastelli imprisoned on extortion charges, Galante had effectively seized control of the Bonanno family, despite lacking formal approval from the commission, the ruling body composed of the bosses of New York's 5 families. Galante's vision for the Bonanno family was ambitious and dangerous. He wanted to dominate the heroin trade, the most lucrative and risky business in organized crime. Heroin brought enormous profits, but also brought intense law enforcement scrutiny. More problematically, Galante's ambitions threatened the interests of the other families, who had carefully negotiated territories and business arrangements. His refusal to share profits and his violent elimination of rivals created enemies not just within the Bonanno family, but across all of New York's criminal underworld. For Joseph Massino, the Galante problem presented a dilemma. Rastelli was his mentor and patron, the man who'd brought him into La Cosa Nostra. But Rastelli was in prison, and Galante controlled the family's operations. Navigating this political situation required the kind of careful judgment that would become Massino's trademark. He needed to appear loyal to whoever held power while remaining truly loyal to Rastelli. The commission watched Galante with growing alarm, his contempt for their authority, his violent expansion into other families' territories, and his monopolistic control over the heroin trade made him a threat to the delicate balance that kept the 5 families from destroying each other. In the Mafia's worldview, individual ambition had to be subordinated to collective stability. Galante's actions violated this principle, and violations of this magnitude had only one remedy: By 1979, the decision had been made at the highest levels. Carmine Galante had to die. The commission authorized his murder, and the execution would be carried out by men from within his own family, a message that no one, regardless of their power, was above the rules of La Cosa Nostra. On July 12, 1979, Carmine Galante was murdered in one of the most famous mob hits in history. He was eating lunch at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant in Brooklyn when 3 masked gunmen entered and opened fire. Galante died in the restaurant's garden, his trademark cigar still clenched between his teeth. The photograph of his corpse became iconic, a symbol of the violent world he'd inhabited and the price of overreaching ambition. While Massino wasn't directly involved in Galante's murder, that honor went to other members of the family. The killing changed the landscape in which he operated, with Galante dead. The path was clear for Rastelli to reclaim leadership once he was released from prison, but the family was fractured, divided between those who'd supported Galante and those who'd remained loyal to Rastelli. Consolidating power would require eliminating potential rivals, and Massino would play a central role in the bloodletting to come. May 5, 1981, stands as one of the most significant dates in Bonanno family history, and in Joseph Massino's personal rise to power on this date. 3 powerful captain's men who controlled crews, territories, and substantial criminal operations were murdered in a coordinated attack that demonstrated both Massino's strategic thinking and his capacity for extreme violence. The 3 captains were Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato, Philip Philly Lucky Giacomi, and Dominic Big Trin Trinchera. These men had supported Carmine Galante, and even after his death, they represented a threat to Rastelli's control. They commanded loyal crews, had access to significant resources, and possessed the ambition to challenge the family's leadership. From Rastelli's perspective, and from Massino's, their continued existence was untenable. The planning for the triple murder showed Massino's evolution as a criminal strategist. This wasn't a simple hit, it was a military operation requiring coordination, timing, and absolute secrecy. The 3 captains had to be lured to a location where they could be killed simultaneously. Preventing any from escaping or seeking revenge, the execution had to be clean, with no witnesses and no evidence that could be traced back to the killers. The meeting was set up under the pretext of resolving tensions within the family. The 3 captains were told they would meet with other family leaders to discuss business matters. They came armed, suspicious, but ultimately unprepared for what awaited them. The location was a social club in Brooklyn, a seemingly neutral ground. But it was a killing floor when the 3 captains arrived. They were met by several Bonanno members, including Joseph Massino. What happened next was brutally efficient. The captains were shot and killed in rapid succession. The violence was overwhelming and absolute. There was no chance for defense, no opportunity for escape. Within minutes, 3 of the most powerful men in the Bonanno family were dead. But killing the captains was only half the challenge. The bodies had to disappear in the Mafia. Missing bodies create uncertainty and fear. They can be more useful than confirmed deaths. When men disappear without a trace, it sends a message. We can erase you completely, as if you never existed. It also complicates law enforcement investigations, since proving murder without a body is extraordinarily difficult. The bodies of Sonny Red, Philly Lucky, and Big Trin were buried in various locations. Over the years, some were discovered by investigators, while others remained hidden. The mystery of their final resting places became part of the legend surrounding the murders, a testament to Massino's thoroughness and his crew's discipline. The 3 Captains Massacre, as it became known, fundamentally altered the power structure within the Bonanno family. It eliminated a significant source of internal opposition and demonstrated that challenging the family's leadership had lethal consequences. For Joseph Massino personally, The murders proved he was more than a capable earner or reliable soldier. He was a leader capable of orchestrating complex operations and making the hard decisions necessary to secure power. But the violence of 1981 wasn't finished. Another problem loomed. One that would require another murder and would set the stage for one of the most damaging infiltrations in FBI history. While Joseph Massino and his crew were consolidating power through murder, the FBI was executing an operation that would devastate the Bonanno family and change the course of organized crime prosecution forever. An agent named Joseph Pistone, working undercover under the name Donnie Brasco, had successfully infiltrated the Bonanno family and spent 6 years building relationships, gathering evidence, and documenting criminal activities. Pistone's undercover operation was unprecedented in its depth and duration. He wasn't merely observing from a distance or conducting brief encounters. He'd become part of the family's daily operations, participating in crimes, attending meetings, and building genuine relationships with members who believed he was a fellow criminal. His primary handler within the family was Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano, a captain who'd vouched for Brasco and brought him deeper into the organization. When Pistone's true identity was revealed in 1981, the shock waves reverberated through every level of the Bonanno family and beyond. For 6 years, an FBI agent had lived among them, learned their secrets, and documented their crimes. The psychological impact was almost as severe as the legal consequences. If Donnie Brasco could fool them for 6 years, who else might be an informant? Could any relationship be trusted? The paranoia that followed would change how the Mafia operated, making members more cautious, more isolated, and more suspicious of everyone around them. The Commission, the ruling body of New York's 5 families, demanded accountability. In their view, the infiltration was a catastrophic security failure that had to be answered for. Someone had brought an FBI agent into the family, and that someone had to pay with their life. The fact that Sonny Black Napolitano had been deceived, that he genuinely believed Donnie Brasco was a legitimate criminal, was irrelevant in the Mafia's harsh calculus. Intentions didn't matter, only results. Dominic Napolitano knew his fate was sealed. The rules were clear, and he'd lived by them his entire criminal career. He'd vouched for an FBI agent, and now he would pay the price in the days before his death. Napolitano put his affairs in order. He gave his jewelry and personal effects to his family, said his goodbyes in the careful, coded language that made men understood without explicitly stating them, and prepared himself for what was coming. August 17, 1981, marked another killing that would cement Joseph Massino's position within the Bonanno family. Dominic "Sonny Black" Napolitano had been summoned to a meeting, the kind of meeting that in the Mafia often serves as a prelude to murder. Napolitano went willingly, understanding that his death was necessary to satisfy the Commission and restore the family's honor. The murder of Sonny Black was different from the 3 captains massacre. This wasn't about eliminating rivals or consolidating power. This was about sending a message, both within the Bonanno family and to the other families. The message was clear. Failure of this magnitude has only one consequence. Even respected, powerful members weren't protected from the rules. Massino played a key role in arranging Napolitano's murder, though the actual killing was carried out by others. Napolitano was shot and killed, but the violence didn't end with his death. In a grotesque symbol of his betrayal, Napolitano's hands were cut off. This mutilation carried specific meaning in the Mafia's symbolic language. He had shaken hands with the devil, brought an enemy into the family's embrace, and his hands were removed as a permanent mark of that betrayal. The disposal of Napolitano's body followed the same pattern as the 3 captains: complete disappearance. For years, his remains were undiscovered, adding to the growing list of men who'd simply vanished. The message was reinforced: cross the family and you don't just die, you cease to exist. For Joseph Massino, the murders of 1981 represented a crucial transition. He'd entered the year as a made member and capable operator. He ended it as one of the most important figures in the family, a man who'd proven himself in the most fundamental way, through violence executed with intelligence and discipline. Philip Rastelli recognized Massino's value and increasingly relied on him for the family's most sensitive operations. But the Donnie Brasco infiltration had damaged the Bonanno family's reputation within the broader mafia hierarchy. The commission considered disbanding the family entirely, an unprecedented step that would have scattered its members among the other 4 families. The Bonannos were forbidden from participating in commission meetings, effectively downgrading them from equals to subordinates within New York's criminal underworld. This humiliation created both challenges and opportunities. The family's diminished status made it harder to operate, as other families felt emboldened to encroach on Bonanno territory. But it also meant less scrutiny, less competition, and more room for an ambitious leader to rebuild when Philip Rastelli eventually died. The man who succeeded him would have the opportunity to resurrect the Bonanno family from its disgrace or destroy what remained of it. That man would be Joseph Massino. Though his path to absolute power would take another decade and require him to navigate both law, enforcement pressure, and internal family politics. The 1980s were paradoxically both the height of Joseph Massino's power and a period of significant legal jeopardy. As he consolidated his position within the Bonanno family, federal prosecutors intensified their efforts to dismantle organized crime through the racketeer-influenced and corrupt Organizations Act RICO. RICO, passed in 1970 but not aggressively used until the 1980s, revolutionized organized crime prosecution. Instead of charging individual crimes separately, RICO allowed prosecutors to charge individuals with operating or participating in a criminal enterprise. This meant that bosses could be held responsible for crimes committed by their subordinates, even if the boss's direct involvement couldn't be proven. It was a weapon specifically designed to destroy the mafia's organizational structure. In 1986, Massino was convicted on labor racketeering charges and sentenced to prison. The conviction represented a setback, but not a catastrophe. Prison was an occupational hazard in the mafia, a cost of doing business that most members experienced at some point. The key was maintaining control and respect even from behind bars, and Massino proved adept at this while imprisoned. Massino continued to build his reputation and strengthen his relationships with key family members. Prison in the federal system wasn't the isolation it might seem. Organized crime figures often found themselves housed together, allowing them to conduct business, settle disputes, and plan for the future. Massino used his time inside to deepen his understanding of the family's operations and position himself as Rastelli's natural successor. Philip "Rusty" Rastelli died on June 24, 1991. While serving a prison sentence for racketeering. His death created a succession question that in other circumstances might have triggered a violent power struggle. But Massino's careful cultivation of relationships, his proven track record of successful operations, and his reputation for both earning and violence made him the consensus choice. Even before his own release from prison, Joseph Massino was named boss of the Bonanno crime family. It was a remarkable achievement, made more significant by the family's weakened state. The Donnie Brasco scandal still cast a shadow over the Bonannos. They remained excluded from commission meetings and were viewed as the weakest of the 5 families. Some within the mafia believed the family should be disbanded entirely. Massino inherited a damaged organization, but he also inherited an opportunity. If he could rebuild the family, restore its reputation, and avoid the mistakes that had led to its humiliation, he could become one of the most powerful mob bosses in New York. When he was released from prison in the early 1990s, that's exactly what he set out to do. Joseph Massino emerged from prison in the early 1990s with a clear vision for the Bonanno family's future. He'd spent years studying the mistakes that had brought down other bosses and led to the family's humiliation. He'd watched flashy bosses attract attention, seen careless communication lead to surveillance, and witnessed how internal betrayals destroyed seemingly unshakable organizations. He was determined not to repeat these errors. Massino's approach to leadership was revolutionary within the context of the American Mafia. While other bosses maintained high profiles, living in ostentatious homes and frequenting expensive restaurants where they held court, Massino lived modestly. He owned and operated a restaurant in Queens called J&S Cake Social Club. But it wasn't a mansion or a nightclub. It was a working-class establishment that allowed him to conduct business while maintaining a low profile. His operational innovations were even more significant. Massino implemented security measures that anticipated the surveillance technologies and investigative techniques law enforcement would use. He banned his members from speaking the words Cosa Nostra or even Mafia, insisting that these terms never be used in conversation. This wasn't superstition, it was a practical security measure. If conversations were recorded, the absence of these identifying terms would make proving the existence of the organization more difficult. He also mandated face-to-face meetings exclusively. In an era when even payphones could be tapped and mobile phones were beginning to proliferate, Massino recognized that electronic communication was the enemy of operational security. Every conversation over a phone was potentially recorded. Every call created a record that could be subpoenaed. By insisting on in-person meetings, he forced his organization to operate the way the Mafia had in earlier eras. Before technology made surveillance easier, perhaps most significantly, Massino compartmentalized the family's operations in ways that previous bosses had not. Members were instructed not to discuss family business, even with each other, unless absolutely necessary. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. This created a structure where if one member was arrested and decided to cooperate, the damage they could do was limited by their restricted knowledge. These security measures came with costs. Communication was slower, coordination more difficult, and the familial atmosphere that had characterized earlier eras of La Cosa Nostra was diminished. But for Massino, these were acceptable trade-offs. Security was paramount, and the alternative, wholesale arrests and convictions, like those that had devastated other families, was unacceptable. Under Massino's leadership, the Bonanno family began to rebuild its criminal operations. Gambling remained a core business, sports betting, numbers, card games, all generating steady revenue with relatively low risk. Loan sharking, the practice of lending money at usurious rates, provided another income stream. Borrowers who couldn't pay faced violence. But the business was lucrative and created leverage over individuals who could be used for other criminal purposes. The family also maintained its involvement in labor unions, particularly in the construction and trucking industries. Union influence allowed the Bonannos to extort legitimate businesses, rig bids, and control job opportunities. It was a form of power that generated both money and political influence, connecting the criminal underworld to legitimate business and government protection rackets. The classic mafia business continued as well. Business owners paid regular tribute for protection from the very men they were paying. It was extortion dressed in euphemism, but it was effective and relatively stable. By the mid-1990s, the Bonanno family was generating millions of dollars in annual revenue. More importantly, it was doing so without the kind of high-profile violence and law enforcement attention that plagued other families. Massino's cautious approach was working. Every boss needs trusted lieutenants, men who can be relied upon to carry out orders, provide counsel, and maintain discipline. For Joseph Massino, the most important relationship was with Salvatore "good-looking Sal" Vitali. His brother-in-law and underboss, Vitelli and Massino's relationship stretched back decades. To before either man was made, they'd committed their first murder together. The killing of Vito Borelli in 1975. They'd been inducted into La Cosa Nostra in the same era. They'd survived the tumultuous early 1980s together. And they were family, connected through marriage to Massino's sister, Josephine. In the Mafia, such bonds were considered unbreakable. Blood and crime mixed together to create loyalty that transcended ordinary relationships. Vitelli served as Massino's underboss, the second in command of the family in this role. He acted as a buffer between the boss and the lower-ranking members, conveying orders, collecting tributes, and handling the day-to-day administration of the family's operations. This structure protected Massino from direct contact with most family members, adding another layer of insulation from law enforcement. But Vitelli was more than an administrator. He was Massino's confidant, one of the few people with whom the boss could speak freely about the family's business, its challenges and its strategies over dozens of years. They built a relationship based on shared experiences, mutual profit, and family connection. To those who observed them, the bond between Massino and Vitelli seemed as solid as any relationship in organized crime could be. Another key figure was Vincent "Vinny" Gorgeous Bassiano, a captain whose loyalty to Massino seemed absolute. Bassiano was cut from a different cloth than Massino, more violent, more impulsive, more traditionally mobster-like in his presentation. But he was effective at running his crew and generating revenue. And Massino valued his loyalty and capability. The inner circle also included various captains who controlled different territories and criminal operations. These men swore loyalty to Massino, paid tribute to him, and relied on his leadership to arbitrate disputes and provide direction. The structure was feudal in many ways, with Massino as the lord and his captains as vassals, each managing their own domains while owing allegiance to the central authority. What appeared to outsiders an unbreakable organization, bound by blood oaths and decades of shared criminality, was actually more fragile than anyone realized. The bonds that seemed strongest would prove most vulnerable when pressure was applied. Men who'd committed murders together would betray each other, family relationships would be shattered, and the loyalty that was supposed to be unto death would evaporate when faced with the prospect of spending the rest of one's life in prison. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, at the peak of Massino's power, these fractures were invisible. The Bonanno family appeared to have successfully rebuilt itself from its Donnie Brasco humiliation. Massino seemed to have created a more secure, more disciplined, more professional criminal organization. The commission had restored the family's seat at the table, recognizing Massino's success in rehabilitating what had been considered a failing enterprise. It was the height of Joseph Massino's power. It was also the beginning of the end. Success in the Mafia is measured partly in money, partly in power, and partly in bodies. Throughout his rise, Joseph Massino had demonstrated his willingness to use violence as a tool for advancement and control. The exact number of murders he ordered or participated in remains uncertain. Estimates range from 10 to more than 20. Each killing served a purpose: eliminating rivals, punishing betrayal, sending messages, consolidating power. Among these murders were the 3 captains in 1981, the elimination of Sonny Black Napolitano, and numerous others whose names are known to law enforcement, but perhaps not to history. Some bodies were found eventually, discovered by investigators, or stumbled upon by accident. Others remain hidden men who vanished into the earth and were forgotten by everyone except those who loved them and those who killed them. This violence wasn't exceptional within the context of the Mafia. Murder was a standard business practice, a method of conflict resolution and organizational management. Bosses throughout history had killed to gain and maintain power. What made Massino's violence significant was how it would eventually be used against him. Each murder created witnesses men who participated in the killings. Each witness represented a potential future threat, someone who might one day face pressure from law enforcement and decide to cooperate. In the Mafia's traditional structure, this vulnerability was managed through Omertà. The code of silence was supposed to ensure that no matter the pressure, members would never testify against each other. Prison was preferable to cooperation. Death was preferable to betrayal. This code had protected the organization for generations, making prosecution extraordinarily difficult even when evidence of crimes existed. But by the 1990s and early 2000s, Omertà was weakening. The RICO statute had made the consequences of conviction much more severe. Instead of short sentences for individual crimes, members now faced decades or life imprisonment for racketeering charges. Faced with spending the rest of their lives in prison, some members began to reconsider their loyalty. The Witness Protection Program offered a way out: cooperate with prosecutors, testify against former associates, and receive a new identity and relocation far from the world of organized crime. The first major breaks in Omertà had occurred in other families. Sammy the Bull Gravano, underboss of the Gambino family, had cooperated against John Gotti, leading to Gotti's conviction and life sentence. Other high-ranking members followed. Each cooperation represented a breach in the wall of silence, and each breach made the next one easier to justify. Joseph Massino, at the height of his power in the early 2000s, had to be aware of this trend. He'd implemented security measures specifically designed to limit the damage from potential cooperators. But security measures could only do so much. The fundamental vulnerability of his position, and of every boss's position, was that power in the Mafia rested on relationships. And relationships could be broken. The ghosts of Massino's past, the men he'd killed and the crimes he'd committed, waited patiently for their revenge. They would get it, though not in any way he could have anticipated. The revenge would come through the words of living men, through testimony given in sterile courtrooms, through the breaking of oaths he believed were sacred. The violence he'd wielded so effectively would ultimately be weaponized against him, not through reciprocal murder, but through something far more damaging: the truth, spoken aloud by men who'd once stood beside him. While Joseph Massino believed his security measures were protecting the Bonanno family, the FBI had been patiently building cases using methods that his precautions couldn't fully prevent. The Bureau had learned from the Donnie Brasco experience, recognizing that while undercover operations were valuable, they were also risky, time-consuming, and difficult to sustain. Instead, they turned to technology and a more insidious strategy: flipping members of the organization itself. The surveillance technologies available to law enforcement in the late 1990s and early 2000s would have seemed like science fiction to earlier generations of mobsters. Tiny recording devices could be hidden in the most unlikely places. Long-range audio equipment could capture conversations from across the street. Vehicles could be tracked using GPS technology. Phone conversations, even those from payphones, could be intercepted with proper warrants. But technology was only part of the FBI strategy. The other part was psychological warfare. Agents would identify lower-level members of the organization, arrest them for relatively minor crimes, and then present them with a choice: face significant prison time or cooperate. The cooperation might be limited at first: wearing a wire to record a few conversations, providing information about criminal activities, identifying participants in crimes. But once a member had crossed the line and begun cooperating, it became easier to cooperate more extensively. The FBI also exploited the natural paranoia within organized crime. Anonymous tips, carefully timed arrests, and strategic leaks could make members suspicious of each other. If everyone feared everyone else might be an informant, the organization's cohesion weakened. Trust, already fragile, became almost impossible to maintain. Joseph Massino had anticipated much of this, which is why he'd implemented his security measures. But no system is perfect, and the sheer scale of law enforcement resources directed at organized crime meant that somewhere, somehow, vulnerabilities would be found and exploited. By the early 2000s, federal prosecutors had built extensive cases against the leadership of all 5 families. The Bonanno family, despite Massino's caution, was not exempt. Prosecutors had testimony from cooperating witnesses, surveillance recordings, financial records showing inexplicable income, and a pattern of criminal activity stretching back decades. The investigation into Massino specifically focused on his role in murders, particularly the 3 Captains massacre and the Sonny Black Napolitano killing. These murders, committed more than 20 years earlier, had seemed safely in the past. Bodies were buried. Witnesses were either dead or sworn to silence, and physical evidence was scarce. But the FBI had something more valuable than physical evidence. They had witnesses willing to testify, and they were actively working to create more. One of the key early cooperators was James Big Lou Tartaglione, a Bonanno associate who began wearing a wire and recording conversations with family members while he was still free. The recordings Tartaglione made provided insights into the family's current operations and helped prosecutors understand the organizational structure. Each recording session was a betrayal, a violation of the trust that supposedly bound the organization together. Massino, despite his intelligence and caution, could not have known the extent of the investigation against him. The FBI's cases were built slowly, patiently, with evidence accumulated over years. By the time subjects of investigation became aware they were being targeted, it was usually too late. The evidence was already gathered, the witnesses already cooperating, the indictments already prepared. The investigation accelerated in the early 2000s. More members were arrested, more were offered cooperation deals, and the pressure on those who refused to cooperate intensified. The FBI was executing a strategy that had proven successful against other families: isolate the leadership, flip the subordinates, and use the testimony of insiders to overcome the challenge of proving what happened in an organization dedicated to secrecy. For Joseph Massino, the walls were closing in. He didn't know it yet, but the empire he'd so carefully built, the security measures he'd so thoughtfully implemented, and the loyalty he believed he'd earned were all about to be tested in ways that would reveal their fundamental weaknesses. January 9, 2003 began as an ordinary day for Joseph Massino. At 60 years old, he'd been leading the Bonanno family for over a decade. He'd survived challenges that had destroyed other bosses. He'd rebuilt a damaged organization into a profitable, disciplined criminal enterprise. He had every reason to believe that his careful approach to leadership had insulated him from the fate that had befallen so many of his peers. That belief was shattered when FBI agents arrived to arrest him. The charges were severe: racketeering, murder, conspiracy, extortion, and numerous other crimes. The indictment read like a history of the Bonanno family's activities over 3 decades, with Massino cast as the central figure in a criminal conspiracy responsible for violence, corruption, and millions of dollars in illegal proceeds. But Massino wasn't arrested alone. The FBI executed a coordinated series of arrests, targeting dozens of Bonanno family members and associates. It was a decapitation strike designed to remove the family's leadership and cripple its operations in a single day. Captains, soldiers, associates, all were rounded up in simultaneous raids across New York. The scope of the operation demonstrated the extent of the FBI's investigation. The indictments were detailed, specific, and devastating. They included charges related to murders committed decades earlier, financial crimes, labor racketeering, and ongoing criminal enterprises. The evidence had been gathered over years from multiple sources, using every investigative tool available to law enforcement. For Massino, the arrest meant the end of freedom. He was taken into federal custody, where he would remain for the duration of his legal proceedings, the modest restaurant he'd operated, the low-profile life he'd maintained, the security measures he'd implemented, none of it had been sufficient. The FBI had gotten through anyway. The news of the arrests reverberated through New York's criminal underworld. The Bonanno family had been struck a devastating blow. Other families watched nervously, knowing that if the FBI could bring down Massino and his organization, no one was safe. The era of invulnerable mob bosses, if it had ever truly existed, was definitively over. For members of the Bonanno family, the arrests created immediate crisis. With the leadership incarcerated and unable to run operations, the family's criminal businesses faced disruption. More critically, each arrested member faced a decision about cooperation. The FBI would be offering deals, presenting evidence, and applying pressure. Some would hold firm, maintaining their silence and accepting whatever prison sentence they received. Others would waver, considering options that would once have been unthinkable. Joseph Massino, sitting in a federal detention facility, had to know that his future depended on the loyalty of the men he led. If they maintained Omertà, if they refused to testify against him, conviction would be difficult. Despite the evidence, the prosecution's case, while extensive, still relied on proving specific crimes and demonstrating Massino's direct involvement. Without insider testimony, that would be challenging. But if his men cooperated, if they broke the code and testified, Massino would be finished. Every murder he'd ordered, every crime he'd orchestrated, every secret he'd kept, all of it could be exposed through the testimony of men who participated beside him. The bonds he'd thought were unbreakable were about to be tested, and the results would determine whether he spent his remaining years in prison or potentially faced execution for his crimes. April 2003 brought news that shattered whatever hope Joseph Massino might have maintained about his legal situation. Salvatore, good-looking Sal Vitali, his brother-in-law, his underboss, his partner for nearly 3 decades, had agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. The betrayal was comprehensive and devastating. Vitali didn't just provide limited information or testify about minor crimes. He gave prosecutors everything. He described murders in detail, naming participants, locations, and methods. He explained the family's organizational structure, its businesses, its rules, and its rituals. He testified about Massino's role in ordering and orchestrating crimes. He provided the kind of detailed insider testimony that prosecutors dream of and defense attorneys fear. Vitali's cooperation was particularly damaging because of his position within the organization and his relationship with Massino. As underboss, he'd been involved in virtually every significant decision and operation. He'd attended meetings, carried out orders, and counseled the boss on sensitive matters. His knowledge was encyclopedic, and he was willing to share all of it. The personal dimension of Vitali's betrayal made it even more painful. This wasn't merely a business associate or subordinate turning informant. This was family married to Massino's sister, connected through blood to Massino's nephews and nieces. They'd grown up in the same world, risen through the ranks together, committed murders side by side. If anyone should have been bound by loyalty, it was Salvatore Vitali. But Vitali, facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, had made a rational calculation. The code of Omertà, which had seemed sacrosanct, wasn't worth dying in prison for. The organization to which he'd sworn eternal loyalty had already been compromised by other cooperators, and the FBI was offering him a way out, a reduced sentence, witness protection, a chance to live his remaining years outside of prison walls. From Vitali's perspective, the betrayal may have seemed justified or even inevitable. Massino himself would later make similar arguments when explaining his own cooperation. But in April 2003, from Massino's cell in federal detention, Vitali's decision must have felt like the ultimate treachery, a violation not just of mob rules, but of family bonds that were supposed to transcend everything else. Vitali wasn't the only cooperator. Though he was the most significant, other members, facing their own legal jeopardy, also agreed to testify. Each cooperation weakened the defense's position and strengthened the prosecution's case. The wall of silence that had protected the Mafia for generations was crumbling, and the rubble was burying Joseph Massino. The testimony these cooperators would provide covered decades of criminal activity. They could describe the three captains' massacre in detail. Who planned it? Who carried it out? What happened to the bodies? They could explain the murder of Sonny Black Napolitano and the reasons behind it. They could detail Massino's ascension to boss and his management of the family. They could quantify the illegal proceeds generated by the family's operations. Most importantly, they could place Massino at the center of it all as the decision-maker, the leader, the boss who ordered murders and directed criminal enterprises. For Massino's defense team, the tsunami of cooperation created nearly insurmountable challenges. How do you defend against former insiders who can describe crimes in intimate detail? How do you discredit witnesses who have nothing to gain by lying and everything to lose if they're caught being dishonest? How do you convince a jury that these multiple cooperators are all fabricating similar stories? The answer, increasingly, was that you couldn't. The prosecution's case, buttressed by Vitali's testimony and supported by other cooperating witnesses, was overwhelming. Joseph Massino, a careful boss who'd implemented unprecedented security measures and avoided the mistakes that had destroyed other leaders, was going to be convicted. The only questions were what charges would stick and what the sentence would be. July 2004 marked the beginning of United States v. Joseph Massino, a trial that would determine the fate of the last old-school mob boss in New York. The courtroom in Brooklyn became the stage for a drama that encapsulated the rise and fall of the American Mafia, told through the testimony of men who'd lived that life and survived to tell about it. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Assistant U.S. attorneys laid out the history of the Bonanno family, explaining to the jury how organized crime functioned, what La Cosa Nostra meant, and how its hierarchical structure operated. They described initiation ceremonies, the Code of Omertà, and the rules that governed behavior within the organization. Then they turned to the specific crimes. The three captains' massacre was described in gruesome detail by witnesses who'd been there. The planning, the execution, the disposal of bodies, all of it was laid bare for the jury. The murder of Sonny Black Napolitano, including the symbolic removal of his hands, was explained in testimony that made clear this wasn't just a killing, but a message about the consequences of betrayal. Salvatore Vitali's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. For days he sat on the witness stand and described 3 decades of criminal activity. He explained how he and Massino had risen through the ranks, committed murders together, and eventually led the family. He detailed specific conversations, specific orders given by Massino, specific crimes orchestrated by the boss. The defense tried to discredit Vitali. Attacking his credibility and motives, they pointed out that he was testifying to reduce his own sentence, that he'd been a willing participant in all the crimes he was describing, that he'd lied and killed throughout his criminal career. But the fundamental problem for the defense was that Vitali's testimony was consistent, detailed, and corroborated by other witnesses and evidence. Other cooperators took the stand as well, each adding pieces to the mosaic of Massino's criminal career. James Tartaglione testified about conversations he'd recorded. Other former members described the family's operations, Massino's leadership style, and specific crimes they'd witnessed or participated in. The cumulative effect was overwhelming, a comprehensive portrait of a criminal organization and its leader, told by insiders who knew the truth. The defense presented character witnesses and tried to cast doubt on the cooperators' testimony, but they were fighting against the weight of evidence. Massino himself did not testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. This was standard practice, but it meant the jury never heard his side of the story directly. The trial lasted several weeks. with testimony that was often technical, occasionally dramatic, and consistently damning for observers. It was a window into a world that most people knew only from movies and television. The reality was less glamorous but more fascinating. A criminal enterprise that functioned like a business, with rules, hierarchy, and ruthless efficiency. For Joseph Massino, sitting at the defense table day after day, the trial must have been a unique form of torture. He was listening to his life's work being dissected and condemned, hearing former friends and associates describe him as a murderer and racketeer, watching as the carefully constructed empire he built was exposed as nothing more than a criminal conspiracy. On July 30th, 2004, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. Joseph Massino was convicted of racketeering, 7 murders, arson, extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and conspiracy. The charges carried a potential death penalty for the murder convictions. At 61 years old, Massino faced the very real possibility that he would be executed or, at minimum, spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The conviction marked the end of an era. Joseph Massino was the last boss of the New York crime family to have risen through the traditional ranks in the traditional way, starting as a street criminal, becoming a made member, earning respect through violence and success, and ascending to the position of boss through a combination of ambition, intelligence, and ruthlessness. The mafia he'd known, the organization he'd served and led, was dying, and he was dying with it. But the story wasn't over. Joseph Massino had one more decision to make, a decision that would be even more shocking than his conviction. It was a decision that would transform him from the last traditional mob boss into something unprecedented in the history of La Cosa Nostra. In the months following his conviction, Joseph Massino faced a future that was bleak by any measure. The death penalty was a real possibility, though federal executions were rare, and the legal process would take years. More likely, he would receive multiple life sentences, meaning he would die in prison at 61 years old, with serious health issues including diabetes. His remaining years would be spent in a maximum security facility, isolated from family and the world he'd known. For a man who'd spent his entire adult life building and wielding power, this prospect represented total defeat. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built, was gone. The Bonanno family was decimated by arrests and cooperations. His carefully implemented security measures had failed. His most trusted associates had betrayed him, and now he faced spending whatever time remained to him in a cage, with no power, no freedom, and no hope. But there was an alternative, and federal prosecutors made sure Massino knew it. They approached his attorneys with a proposition: if Massino cooperated, if he provided testimony against other organized crime figures, if he helped the government build cases against his former associates, his sentence could be reduced. He might avoid the death penalty. He might even eventually be released from prison. The proposition required Massino to do something that no boss of a New York crime family had ever done. It required him to become a government informant, to violate Omertà, to betray the oath he'd taken in 1977 when he was inducted into La Cosa Nostra. It required him to testify against men he'd worked with, men he'd led, men who trusted him and believed in the code that supposedly bound them all. The decision Massino faced was fundamentally about whether the code meant anything. Omertà had protected the Mafia for generations, but that protection was based on mutual adherence. When everyone keeps the code, everyone is protected, but when some break it, those who hold firm are simply making themselves vulnerable without receiving any benefit. Salvatore Vitali had already violated Omertà by testifying against Massino. Other members had cooperated as well. The code, in practical terms, was already broken. Massino also had to consider his own culpability and the reality of his situation. He'd ordered and participated in murders. He'd run a criminal organization. He'd profited from illegal activities for decades. The government had proven all of this in court. No technicality would save him. No appeal would overturn his conviction. His only options were to die in prison, maintaining a code that others had already violated, or to cooperate and potentially gain some measure of freedom in his remaining years. There was also the question of loyalty's direction. Massino had been loyal to the Bonanno family for decades. He'd killed for the family, served prison time for the family, and built the family into a profitable enterprise. But what had that loyalty bought him? Betrayal by his brother-in-law, betrayal by other members, conviction and imprisonment. If the organization had been loyal to him, perhaps his loyalty to it would have meant something. But loyalty, as it turned out, was conditional and fragile. In January 2005, Joseph Massino made his decision. He agreed to cooperate with the federal government. He would become an informant, providing testimony and information about the Bonanno family and other organized crime figures. He would violate the oath he'd sworn nearly 30 years earlier. He would become, in the language of the underworld, a rat. The decision was unprecedented. Underbosses had cooperated before, Salvatore Gravano being the most famous example. Captains and soldiers had flipped in increasing numbers. But a boss, the absolute leader of a family, had never crossed this line. Bosses were supposed to exemplify the code, to demonstrate that some principles were worth dying for. They were supposed to be the living embodiment of Omertà. Joseph Massino shattered that expectation. He chose survival over principle, pragmatism over tradition, and his own interests over organizational loyalty. The decision would define his legacy more than anything else he'd done in his criminal career. He would be remembered not primarily as the boss who rebuilt the Bonanno family, but as the boss who betrayed it. Massino's cooperation began even before his formal agreement with prosecutors, in a move that demonstrated both his value as a cooperator and the depth of his betrayal. Massino agreed to wear a recording device and engage in conversations with other organized crime figures while he was incarcerated. His primary target was Vincent "Vinny" Gorgeous Bastiano, who had become acting boss of the Bonanno family after Massino's arrest. Bastiano, unaware that Massino was cooperating, continued to treat him with the respect and deference due to a boss. He visited Massino in prison, discussed family business, and most critically, revealed information about ongoing criminal activities and plans. The conversations Massino recorded were devastating for Bastiano. In one particularly damaging exchange, Bastiano discussed his intention to assassinate a federal prosecutor. Plotting to murder a prosecutor is among the most serious crimes imaginable. Carrying the death penalty and demonstrating a willingness to attack the justice system itself. Bastiano's words, recorded by Massino, would later be used to convict him and ultimately result in a death sentence. The irony of the situation was profound. Bastiano had been loyal to Massino, had risen through the ranks under his leadership, and had taken on the responsibility of leading the family in Massino's absence. His reward for this loyalty was betrayal. The man he visited in prison, the man he trusted with sensitive information, was secretly working for the government, recording every word to be used as evidence for federal prosecutors. Massino's cooperation was extraordinarily valuable. He could provide testimony about murders, criminal enterprises, and organizational structures based on decades of direct involvement at the highest levels. He could explain how the Mafia operated from the perspective of someone who'd led a family. He could identify criminal activities and participants across all 5 families. Massino's cooperation led to numerous indictments and convictions. The information he provided helped prosecutors build cases against organized crime figures throughout New York. Each prosecution further weakened the Mafia's structure, removing leaders and creating more pressure on remaining members to cooperate themselves. As part of his cooperation agreement, Massino also forfeited substantial assets. He surrendered 270 gold bars and approximately $7 million in cash and property. These assets represented decades of criminal proceeds, the material rewards of his life in organized crime. Giving them up was part of the price of cooperation, but it also symbolized the complete dismantling of everything he built. The extent of Massino's cooperation remained secret for months, known only to prosecutors, his attorneys, and the targets of his testimony, but eventually, the truth emerged. Other organized crime figures learned that Massino had flipped. The revelation sent shock waves through the underworld. If a boss could break Omertà, if someone who'd led a family and ordered murders could become an informant, then no one could be trusted. The code that had protected the Mafia for generations was officially dead. June 23, 2013, nearly 9 years after his conviction, Joseph Massino appeared in federal court for resentencing. The original sentence, multiple life terms with no possibility of parole, had been reconsidered based on his cooperation with prosecutors. What followed was a hearing that highlighted just how valuable that cooperation had been. Prosecutors detailed Massino's assistance to the government. He'd testified in multiple trials, helping to convict over 50 organized crime figures. He'd provided information about murders that had remained unsolved for decades. He'd explained organizational structures and criminal operations in ways that only someone of his position could. His cooperation had been extensive, genuine, and extraordinarily useful to law enforcement. Defense attorneys argued that Massino deserved consideration for this cooperation. They pointed out that he'd taken enormous personal risk by informing. If other organized crime figures could reach him, his life would be worth nothing. They noted that his information had helped dismantle criminal organizations and potentially saved lives by preventing future crimes. The judge, while acknowledging the severity of Massino's crimes, recognized the value of his cooperation. The revised sentence was time served, essentially. The years Massino had already spent in custody since his arrest in 2003. He would be released from federal prison and placed in the Witness Protection Program. For someone who'd been facing the death penalty or multiple life sentences, this was an extraordinary outcome. It demonstrated the government's willingness to provide substantial benefits to cooperators, even those who'd committed terrible crimes. It also demonstrated how completely the power dynamics had shifted. A man who'd once been one of the most powerful mobsters in America was now dependent on the government for his survival and freedom. Massino's release into witness protection marked his complete transformation from mob boss to government informant. He would be given a new identity, relocated far from New York, and provided with security and support to start a new life. The man who'd built an empire through violence and crime would disappear into American suburbia, living anonymously among people who had no idea of his past. The sentence generated controversy. Victims' families expressed outrage that a man responsible for multiple murders was being released. Critics argued that no amount of cooperation could truly atone for killing human beings. They questioned whether justice was served when murderers could negotiate their way out of life sentences by betraying their accomplices. Prosecutors defended the deal, arguing that cooperation from high-level organized crime figures was essential to dismantling these organizations. Without incentives for cooperation, they argued, prosecutions would be far more difficult and less effective. Massino's testimony had helped convict many dangerous criminals who might otherwise have escaped justice. From a utilitarian perspective, the deal made sense, even if it seemed morally questionable for organized crime figures still loyal to the old code. Massino's sentence was proof that Omertà was dead and that the government had won. The message was clear: cooperate and get out, or stay loyal and die in prison. Increasingly, criminals were choosing cooperation. The Mafia of the 21st century was a shadow of its former self, weakened by prosecutions, decimated by informants, and unable to attract new members who believed in the old values, Joseph Massino, at 70 years old, walked out of federal custody and into witness protection. He'd survived, the pragmatist to the end, choosing life over principle, freedom over loyalty. Whether this made him a coward or a realist depends on one's perspective. But one thing was certain: he'd fundamentally changed what it meant to be a mob boss in America. September 14, 2023, marked the end of Joseph Massino's remarkable life. He died in witness protection at the age of 80. The cause of death was not publicly disclosed. The man who'd risen from the streets of Queens to command one of New York's 5 families, who'd survived decades of violence and intrigue, who'd broken the code that was supposed to be sacrosanct, passed away in anonymity, far from the world he'd once dominated. The news of his death received modest coverage. Massino had been out of the public eye for over a decade, living under an assumed name and undisclosed location. Most people had forgotten about him or never knew who he was. Unlike other mob bosses whose deaths became major news events, Massino's passing was noted briefly and then forgotten. There was no funeral in the traditional sense, at least not the kind of elaborate send-off that mob bosses historically received. No procession of black cars, no gathering of family and associates, no public mourning. Witness protection meant severing ties to the past, and that included the rituals that marked the passage from life to death. Massino died as he'd lived his final years, hidden, protected, and isolated from the world he'd once known. For the Bonanno family, Massino's death was barely relevant. The organization he'd once led was a shell of its former self. Weakened by decades of prosecutions and cooperation, new leadership had emerged. But they operated in a dramatically different environment. Law enforcement scrutiny was constant, recruitment was difficult, and the mystique that had once surrounded the Mafia had evaporated. The family continued to exist, but it was a pale imitation of what Massino had commanded in his prime. Massino's death closed the book on a specific era of American organized crime. He was the last mob boss who'd risen through the traditional ranks in the traditional way, who'd experienced the Mafia when it was still powerful, still feared, still able to operate with relative impunity. The bosses who came after him would face a different reality: constant surveillance, aggressive prosecution, and the knowledge that cooperation was always an option and often the rational choice. The reaction to his death within the remaining organized crime community was likely mixed. Some probably felt satisfaction that a man who'd violated Omertà had died, even if he'd lived longer than many felt he deserved. Others might have felt indifferent, recognizing that Massino's betrayal was simply a symptom of a larger reality. The code was dead. Loyalty was extinct, and survival required adaptation to new circumstances. For law enforcement, Massino's death marked the end of a valuable cooperator. His testimony had helped secure dozens of convictions, and his willingness to cooperate had encouraged others to do the same. He demonstrated that even the most hardened criminals, even those who'd risen to the highest positions, could be turned. This lesson had reshaped how prosecutors approached organized crime cases and how they pressured defendants to cooperate. Joseph Massino died peacefully, we must assume, in his bed, surrounded by whatever family remained willing to associate with him under his new identity. This was a privilege denied to many of his victims, who died violently, often afraid and in pain, buried in unmarked graves or dissolved in acid. The injustice of this disparity, that a murderer died peacefully while his victims died terribly, is one of the uncomfortable realities of the cooperation system. Justice, in practical terms, is often about utility rather than morality. The Bonanno crime family that exists today bears little resemblance to the organization Joseph Massino led. The cooperations, arrests, and prosecutions that began with Massino's flip continued for years. Each one further weakened the family structure and capabilities. By the 2020s, The Bonannos were considered the weakest of New York's 5 families, a dramatic reversal from their status in the early 2000s. The family's traditional businesses, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, continued. But at a much smaller scale. Law enforcement scrutiny made large operations dangerous, and the lack of secure leadership made coordination difficult. New York's gambling landscape had also changed dramatically with the legalization of various forms of betting, reducing the market for illegal operations. What once generated millions now produced far less. Recruitment of new members became increasingly challenging. Young criminals had other options. Drug trafficking often paid better and carried similar risks. The mystique of the Mafia, which had once attracted ambitious criminals, had faded. Movies and television shows depicted mobsters as either cartoonish figures or tragic anti-heroes, but rarely as successful or admirable. Why join an organization that was clearly dying and offered no real security or future? The leadership structure that Massino had carefully constructed was destroyed. His successors operated under constant threat of arrest, unable to implement the long-term strategies that had characterized Massino's rule. Acting bosses came and went, some arrested within months of taking leadership. Captains who might once have led crews of dozens now commanded handfuls of associates. The organizational depth that allowed families to survive arrests and prosecutions had evaporated. Perhaps most significantly, trust within the family, already damaged by Massino's cooperation, never recovered. Members who worked together had to constantly wonder if their associates were wearing wires or planning to cooperate. This paranoia made communication difficult and coordinated operations nearly impossible. The efficiency that comes from trust and loyalty, which had been the Mafia's great advantage, was gone. Other families watched the Bonannos collapse and saw their own futures. The Gambinos, Genoveses, Luccheses, and Colombos all faced similar pressures. While some were stronger than others, all were shadows of their former selves. The era of the Mafia as a dominant force in American organized crime was over. Other groups, Russian, Albanian, Asian, and Mexican criminal organizations had moved into spaces the Italian-American Mafia once controlled. The Commission, which had once dictated policy across all 5 families, became increasingly irrelevant. Meetings still occurred occasionally, but they were more about managing decline than exercising real power. The bosses who attended couldn't offer protection to subordinates, couldn't guarantee their own freedom, and couldn't command the respect that earlier generations had taken for granted. For historians and criminologists, the Bonanno family's trajectory from its peak under Massino to its current diminished state offers a case study in organizational collapse. The factors that destroyed it: aggressive prosecution, technological surveillance, the breakdown of Omertà, and the cooperation of high-level members, were systemic, vulnerabilities that no amount of intelligence or caution could fully address. Massino had been smart, careful, and strategic, but ultimately these qualities only delayed the inevitable. Who was Joseph Massino beyond the crimes, the murders, and the betrayals? Understanding the man requires looking beyond the sensational aspects of his story to examine the qualities and circumstances that shaped his life. Massino was, by all accounts, highly intelligent. His rise from street criminal to boss of a major crime family required not just ruthlessness, but strategic thinking, political acumen, and the ability to learn from observation. He watched other bosses make mistakes, attracting attention through flamboyance, using electronic communication carelessly, trusting the wrong people, and he consciously avoided these errors. His security measures, while ultimately insufficient, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of law enforcement methods. He was also patient in ways that many criminals are not. The criminal world rewards patience and often punishes impulsivity. Massino's willingness to wait, to build slowly, to think long-term rather than chasing immediate gratification, These qualities separated him from less successful criminals who burned bright and fast before flaming out. But intelligence and patience coexisted with ruthlessness and moral flexibility. Massino could order murders without apparent remorse. He could betray trust when it served his interests. He could live with the knowledge that he'd ended lives and destroyed families. This combination of cognitive sophistication and ethical blankness is characteristic of successful career criminals. The ability to recognize moral rules while not feeling bound by them. His relationships reveal complexity. He was married for decades, had children, maintained family connections, by accounts from those who knew him socially. He could be charming, generous, and loyal to those within his inner circle, yet this personal loyalty coexisted with the willingness to kill associates and, eventually, cooperate against even his closest companions. The compartmentalization required to be both a family man and a murderer is psychologically fascinating and morally troubling. Massino's decision to cooperate raises questions about his true values. Did he ever genuinely believe in Omertà? Or was it simply a useful fiction that served his interests while those interests aligned with the organization's? His willingness to break the code when faced with the death penalty or life imprisonment suggests that survival was always his primary value, and loyalty was conditional on circumstances. Some have argued that Massino was simply a pragmatist, a man who understood that loyalty is a transaction rather than a principle. When the organization provided protection and profit, he was loyal to it. When it could no longer protect him and his own people had betrayed him first, his loyalty transferred to himself and his own survival. From this perspective, his cooperation wasn't inconsistent with his character. It was entirely consistent with a lifetime of making calculated decisions based on self-interest. Others view him as fundamentally unprincipled, a man who lived by a code only as long as it was convenient and abandoned it the moment adherence became costly. This interpretation casts his entire criminal career in a different light, not as the story of a loyal soldier who rose through dedication, but as the story of an opportunist who used the structures and values while never truly internalizing them. The truth likely lies somewhere between these interpretations. Massino was neither purely pragmatic nor purely opportunistic, neither wholly principled nor completely immoral. He was a human being, complicated and contradictory, capable of loyalty and betrayal, of strategic thinking and emotional attachment, of violence and ordinary human connection. The extremity of his circumstances, the violence of his world, the stakes of his decisions, the consequences of his choices magnified these contradictions but didn't create them. They exist, in smaller form, in most human beings. What made Massino significant wasn't his uniqueness, but his representativeness. He embodied the American dream corrupted, the immigrant community's son who sought success and power through crime rather than legitimate channels. He demonstrated how organizational structures can normalize violence and create cultures where murder becomes routine business. He showed how loyalty and honor can be invoked to justify terrible acts, while ultimately proving insufficient to bind people together when truly tested. His intelligence made him more successful than most criminals. His patience allowed him to survive longer, and his caution extended his criminal career, but ultimately, these qualities only delayed the inevitable. The structural factors that destroyed him, technological surveillance, aggressive prosecution, the breakdown of Omertà would have gotten him eventually. Regardless of his personal qualities, he was swimming against a historical tide that no individual could resist indefinitely. In the narrative of Joseph Massino's life, it's easy to focus on the dramatic elements, the murders, the power, the betrayal, the cooperation. But beneath these sensational aspects lie the real human cost of his criminal career. The people he killed, the families he destroyed, the communities he damaged. These are the true legacy of his life in organized crime. Consider the three captains, Alphonse and Delicato, Philip Giacconi, and Dominic Trinchera. These men were themselves criminal, certainly not innocent victims. They'd chosen the same life Massino had chosen, accepted its risks, and participated in its violence. But they were also human beings with families who loved them, children who needed them, lives that extended beyond their criminal activities. When they were murdered on May 5, 1981, they left behind wives who became widows, children who grew up without fathers, and parents who had to bury their sons. The impact on these families was profound and permanent. The wives had to somehow explain to children why their father wasn't coming home. They had to manage grief while dealing with the practical realities of lost income and changed circumstances. Some knew or suspected their husbands were involved in organized crime. Others may have been deliberately kept ignorant. Either way, they paid a price for choices they didn't make. The children of murdered mobsters face unique challenges. They grow up with the knowledge that their father was killed, often violently. In many cases, they don't know who is responsible or why it happened. The mystery can haunt them their entire lives. Some struggle with anger and thoughts of revenge. Others try to escape their father's shadow and build legitimate lives. All carry the burden of their father's choices and the violence that ended his life. Dominic Napolitano's murder exemplifies the cruelty embedded in Massino's world. Napolitano knew he was going to be killed. He'd been duped by an FBI agent and had to pay the price. He walked to his death knowingly, trying to face it with whatever dignity the situation allowed. The removal of his hands, the symbolic mutilation that marked him as someone who'd shaken hands with the devil, added a layer of degradation to murder. His family had to live with this knowledge, understanding that he died not just violently, but with intentional dishonor beyond the specific murder victims. Massino's criminal enterprise affected countless others. Business owners who paid protection money lost legitimate profits to extortion. Workers in industries controlled by the mob faced corruption that limited opportunities and distorted labor markets. Communities where the Bonanno family operated saw violence, intimidation, and the normalization of criminal behavior that made legitimate success seem impossible. The families of cooperating witnesses also paid prices they didn't deserve. When Salvatore Vitali flipped, his wife Massino's sister, Josephine, found herself caught between her husband and her brother. The betrayals on both sides shattered family relationships. Children saw their parents destroyed by forces beyond their control. Extended family members had to choose sides or try to maintain impossible neutrality. Even Massino's own family suffered because of his choices. His wife and children had to live with the knowledge of what he'd done, the people he'd killed, the lives he destroyed. When he was arrested and convicted, they lost husband and father to prison. When he cooperated, they faced the additional burden of his betrayal in witness protection. Whatever family relationship survived had to be maintained across geographical distance and identity changes. The broader social costs of organized crime are harder to quantify, but equally real. The mafia's control of legitimate industries drove up costs for consumers and created barriers to honest competition. Political corruption facilitated by organized crime weakened democratic institutions. The violence associated with mob activity made communities less safe and contributed to cycles of crime and poverty. It's important to remember these victims when evaluating Massino's life and legacy. His story is dramatic and in some ways fascinating, but it's fundamentally a story of destruction. The power he wielded was power over others, gained through violence and maintained through fear. The empire he built was built on exploitation and suffering. The intelligence he demonstrated was intelligence in service of criminal ends. This doesn't mean his story isn't worth telling or studying. Understanding how organized crime functions, how individuals become criminals, and how criminal organizations rise and fall has value for society, law enforcement, and anyone interested in human behavior. But the telling should never glamorize or romanticize the reality of what organized crime does to real people. Joseph Massino left a trail of destruction across decades. Some of his victims were criminals themselves, people who'd chosen the sane life and accepted its risks. But many were innocent, family members, business owners, ordinary people who had the misfortune to exist in the spaces where the Bonanno family operated. All of them paid prices for Massino's choices, and their suffering should be central to how his life is remembered and judged. Joseph Massino's rise and fall occurred during a period of fundamental transformation in American organized crime. Understanding his story requires understanding the broader context in which he operated, and how that context changed during his lifetime. When Massino was initiated into La Cosa Nostra in 1977, the American Mafia was still powerful, still feared, and still operating with relative confidence. The five families controlled significant criminal enterprises in New York. They influenced legitimate businesses, corrupted unions, and maintained relationships with politicians and law enforcement. The Code of Omertà protected them from prosecution, even when evidence of crimes existed. Bosses lived publicly, often ostentatiously, confident that their positions insulated them from serious legal consequences. This confidence was based on historical experience. For decades, prosecutors had struggled to build cases against organized crime figures. Individual crimes could be proven, but demonstrating the existence of criminal organizations and connecting bosses to crimes carried out by subordinates was extraordinarily difficult. Witnesses were intimidated or murdered. Evidence was destroyed or never created. Juries, particularly in communities with Italian-American populations, were sometimes sympathetic or at least reluctant to convict based on the testimony of admitted criminals. The passage of the RICO Act in 1970 represented a turning point. Though its impact wasn't immediately apparent, RICO allowed prosecutors to charge individuals with racketeering, essentially, with participating in an ongoing criminal enterprise. This meant that bosses could be held responsible for crimes committed by their organization, even without direct evidence of their personal involvement in specific acts. Patterns of behavior, organizational structure, and testimony about how the organization functioned became admissible and relevant. But RICO alone wasn't sufficient to destroy the mafia. The law had to be combined with other changes: improved surveillance technology, more aggressive investigation techniques, and most importantly, the willingness of organized crime figures to cooperate with prosecutors. The latter development was the most significant and the most unexpected. Throughout its history, the mafia had relied on Omertà to protect itself. The code wasn't just a moral principle. It was a practical security measure. If members didn't testify against each other, prosecutors couldn't use insider testimony to prove crimes. Physical evidence alone was rarely sufficient for conviction. The wall of silence made the organization almost immune to prosecution. This wall began to crack in the 1980s and collapsed entirely in the 1990s and 2000s. The reasons were multiple. RICO charges carried much longer sentences than earlier charges for specific crimes. Instead of 5 or 10 years, members faced 20 years to life. The Witness Protection Program offered genuine protection for cooperators and their families, making cooperation less suicidal than it had been when informants were simply left to fend for themselves after testifying. And perhaps most importantly, the social and cultural context that had supported Omertà was weakening. Younger members of organized crime didn't have the same attachment to the old values. They'd grown up in a different era with different influences and often joined organized crime for purely economic rather than cultural or ethnic reasons. The Italian-American communities that had produced earlier generations of mobsters had largely assimilated and moved to suburbs. The social structures that had reinforced the code tight-knit neighborhoods, cultural identity, family honor were much weaker. Joseph Massino witnessed and participated in this transformation. He'd been initiated during the old era, when the Mafia seemed powerful and permanent. He'd adapted to new challenges by implementing security measures that reflected changing realities. And ultimately, he'd embodied the complete collapse of the old code by cooperating himself, demonstrating that even bosses, the supposed keepers of tradition and principle, would break Omertà when faced with sufficient pressure. His cooperation didn't just affect the Bonanno family. It sent a message throughout organized crime: no one was beyond flipping. No oath was truly sacred, no bond was permanent. If a boss could cooperate, then literally anyone could. This knowledge fundamentally changed how organized crime operated. Trust became impossible, communication became dangerous, coordination became extremely difficult. The American Mafia of the 21st century is a shell of what it was in Massino's youth. The five families still exist nominally, but their power, wealth, and influence are dramatically reduced. They're unable to control legitimate industries, unable to corrupt government systematically, unable to operate with the impunity their predecessors enjoyed. Law enforcement doesn't fear them the way earlier generations of FBI agents and prosecutors feared the Mafia. They're criminals to be managed, not an existential threat to public order. Other criminal organizations have risen to fill spaces the Mafia once controlled: drug trafficking, which the traditional Mafia approached cautiously because of the severe legal penalties it attracted, is now dominated by Mexican cartels, Dominican networks, and other groups. Cybercrime has created entirely new categories of criminal enterprise that the Mafia is ill-equipped to exploit. Human trafficking, illegal gambling, and other traditional rackets continue, but are now competitive markets rather than Mafia monopolies. The transformation wasn't inevitable, but it was probably unavoidable given the combination of factors working against organized crime. Technology favored law enforcement, surveillance became easier, communication became trackable, and financial transactions became transparent. Legal tools like RICO gave prosecutors weapons specifically designed to destroy criminal organizations. Social changes weakened the communities and cultural contexts that had supported the Mafia. And the breakdown of Omertà, once begun, accelerated rapidly as each cooperation encouraged others. Joseph Massino didn't cause this transformation, but he accelerated it, his cooperation as a boss, following Salvatore Vitali's cooperation as an underboss, demolished whatever remained of the code's authority after Massino. No one could credibly argue that Omertà was absolute or that traditional values would protect anyone. The message was clear: save yourself because no one else will. At the heart of Joseph Massino's story lies a question about the nature of loyalty. What does it mean? Where does it come from? And when, if ever, is it justified to violate it? The Mafia's conception of loyalty was absolute and non-negotiable. Once initiated, a member was bound for life. The oath taken during the induction ceremony was sacred, sworn with blood and sealed with the understanding that violation meant death. This loyalty was supposed to transcend all other relationships. It came before family, before self-interest, before law, before everything. It was the foundational principle that allowed the organization to function despite constant pressure from law enforcement and rivals. But was this loyalty ever real? Or was it always a useful fiction that worked only as long as everyone pretended to believe it? Evidence suggests the latter. Throughout Mafia history, members betrayed each other when convenient. Bosses were murdered by their subordinates. Families engaged in warfare with each other. Despite supposedly being bound by common codes and mutual respect, informants existed in every era, though they were fewer and more harshly punished than in recent decades. What made the traditional Mafia's loyalty code functional wasn't that everyone genuinely believed in it, but that the costs of violation were so severe that most members behaved as if they believed. Informants were killed, along with their families. Violating Omertà meant death, and not just for the traitor, but potentially for anyone connected to them. The punishment was so certain and so severe that it overcame most people's inclination towards self-preservation through cooperation. This system worked for generations, but contained inherent vulnerabilities. It required that the organization be able to reach informants and carry out executions. It required that informants not receive sufficient protection to make cooperation survivable. And it required that prison sentences be short enough that maintaining silence seemed preferable to cooperation. All of these conditions changed. The Witness Protection Program made cooperation survivable by giving informants new identities and relocating them beyond the organization's reach. RICO sentences made silence devastating. Spending one's entire life in prison became the cost of loyalty. And improved law enforcement made carrying out retaliation against cooperators increasingly difficult and risky. As the practical foundations of the loyalty code eroded, the philosophical justifications were exposed as hollow. Why should someone maintain loyalty to an organization that couldn't protect them? That would abandon them to life imprisonment? That was itself full of informants and traitors. The reciprocal nature of loyalty became apparent. It only makes sense when it flows in both directions. Joseph Massino's decision to cooperate can be understood through this framework. He'd been loyal to the Bonanno family for decades. But when he faced the death penalty or life imprisonment, the family couldn't help him. His underboss had already cooperated against him. Other members were flipping. The organization he'd served and led was shattered in this context. Maintaining loyalty meant sacrificing himself for a principle that others had already abandoned and an organization that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. This doesn't make his cooperation morally justified. He'd killed people, ordered murders, run a criminal enterprise. He bore responsibility for real harm to real people. His cooperation was about escaping consequences for his own crimes, not about some noble commitment to justice. But it does make his cooperation rationally understandable, even if morally questionable. The broader lesson concerns the nature of organizational loyalty. Organizations inspire loyalty by providing benefits, protection, identity, purpose, belonging. When organizations fail to provide these benefits, loyalty becomes irrational. Members who continue to sacrifice for organizations that can't or won't reciprocate aren't noble. They're exploited. The Mafia's loyalty code, for all its rhetoric about honor and principle, was ultimately about organizational security. It protected the organization from prosecution by ensuring silence from members. When framed this way, the code's collapse becomes easier to understand. Why should individual members sacrifice themselves for organizational security when the organization can't secure them? This analysis applies beyond organized crime. Many organizations, corporations, governments, institutions demand loyalty from members while providing limited reciprocal commitment. Employees are expected to be loyal to companies that will lay them off when profitable. Citizens are told to be loyal to nations that may not protect their rights. Members of institutions are expected to subordinate their interests to organizational needs without guaranteed reciprocity. The Mafia's experience suggests that such one-sided loyalty is ultimately unsustainable. When the cost of loyalty becomes severe and the benefits disappear, rational actors will defect regardless of prior commitments or proclaimed principles. Loyalty that isn't mutual isn't truly loyalty. It's exploitation dressed in noble language. Joseph Massino's betrayal of Omertà, then, can be seen not as a unique moral failure, but as a predictable outcome of changing incentives and collapsing reciprocity. He wasn't the first to cooperate, and he wasn't the last. He was simply the most significant, the highest ranking, the most symbolically important. His cooperation didn't create the crisis in Mafia loyalty. It revealed and confirmed a crisis that had been developing for decades. Joseph Massino's life story is, in many ways, a dark parody of the American dream. He rose from humble origins through ambition, intelligence, and hard work. He built an organization and accumulated power. He achieved a form of success that commanded respect in his community. But the means he used, violence, crime, exploitation, corrupted whatever achievements he gained. The American dream promises that success is available to anyone willing to work for it, regardless of their starting position, in its legitimate form. This dream is realized through education, entrepreneurship, talent, and effort. But there's always been a shadow version, the idea that success can be achieved through crime, if legitimate paths are blocked or too slow. For Italian immigrants and their descendants in the early and mid-20th century, discrimination and limited opportunities made legitimate success difficult. The Mafia offered an alternative path to wealth and power for those willing to accept its costs and risks. It was, in this sense, a perverted version of American opportunity, a way to achieve material success and social standing through criminal enterprise rather than legitimate business. Joseph Massino, born in 1943, came of age in an era when this criminal path seemed viable, even attractive. The men who had power and respect in his community were often connected to organized crime. Legitimate work offered limited prospects for a high school dropout, the alternative hijacking trucks. Earning money through theft and violence offered faster routes to material success. His rise through the ranks showed genuine entrepreneurial ability. He identified opportunities, built relationships, managed risk, and strategically positioned himself for advancement in a legitimate business context. These skills might have made him successful in conventional terms, but in the criminal context, they made him a mob boss successful by criminal standards, but ultimately destructive to himself and others. The power Massino wielded was real but limited within the narrow world of organized crime. He commanded respect, fear, and obedience. His decisions affected people's lives and deaths. His approval or disapproval could make or destroy criminal careers. This is a form of power, certainly, but its power constrained by illegitimacy. He couldn't exercise it openly, couldn't leverage it into legitimate influence beyond certain limits, and couldn't secure it against law enforcement pressure. Violence was essential to this power. Massino didn't maintain control through persuasion or legitimate authority. He maintained it through the credible threat of murder. Associates followed his orders because they feared the consequences of refusal. This kind of power is inherently unstable. It lasts only as long as the capacity for violence can be maintained and the costs of rebellion seem too high. The collapse of Massino's power followed predictably from its foundations. Power based on violence and fear evaporates when those who hold it lose the capacity to use force. Once arrested and imprisoned, Massino couldn't hurt his former associates. The fear that had compelled their obedience no longer applied. Combined with legal pressure and incentives to cooperate, this meant his former subordinates had every reason to betray him and few reasons to maintain loyalty. The American dream promises not just material success, but also security, respect, and the ability to pass advantages to the next generation. Massino achieved wealth, at least for a time, but never security. He lived with constant risk of arrest, imprisonment, or murder. The respect he commanded was based on fear rather than genuine admiration. And what could he pass to his children? A legacy of crime, violence, and ultimately, betrayal. Whatever material advantages he might have provided were overshadowed by the damage his choices inflicted on his family. His story reveals the emptiness at the center of the criminal version of success. The money, power, and respect that organized crime offers come at costs that ultimately outweigh the benefits. The life Massino chose involved constant violence, betrayal of trust, legal jeopardy, and moral compromise. He spent years in prison, lost everything he'd built, and ended his life in hiding. Cut off from the world he'd known, Compared to a legitimate life, even a working-class life of the kind his father lived, Massino's criminal career was a catastrophe. He experienced more material success, but also vastly more suffering, both personally and in terms of harm he caused others. If the American dream is about achieving happiness and security through effort, then Massino's version was a nightmare that merely looked like a dream from a distance. This doesn't mean legitimate paths to success are always available or fair. Discrimination, inequality, and limited opportunities are real obstacles that make the American dream inaccessible to many. But the criminal alternative that Massino represents isn't a genuine solution to these problems. It's a trap that destroys everyone who falls into it while creating harm that radiates outward to families and communities. The tragedy of Joseph Massino's life isn't just that he failed, though he certainly did fail spectacularly in the end. The tragedy is that he succeeded for a long time at something worthless and destructive. He achieved power that wasn't worth having, accumulated wealth that he couldn't keep, and built an organization that was fundamentally harmful. His intelligence and talent were wasted on pursuits that created only destruction. The title Last Godfather carries multiple meanings when applied to Joseph Massino. In one sense, it's literally true. He was the last traditional mob boss of a New York family. The last to have risen through the old system and the old way during the era when the Mafia was still powerful. The bosses who came after him operated in a fundamentally different environment and were themselves transitional figures, managing decline rather than wielding genuine power. In another sense, the title is symbolic. Massino represents the end of an era, the final expression of something that had dominated American organized crime for generations. When he cooperated, he didn't just betray the Bonanno family. He destroyed whatever remained of the mystique, tradition, and code that had defined La Cosa Nostra. After Massino, the idea of the honorable gangster, the boss who lived and died by the code, became impossible to sustain even as fiction. The archetypal godfather, as portrayed in movies and popular culture, is a figure of power, respect, and tragic dignity. He lives by a code, even if that code serves brutal ends. He commands loyalty through personal force and institutional authority. He may be a criminal, but he's a criminal with principles. Someone who adheres to rules even as he breaks laws. The Godfather may fall, but he falls nobly. Destroyed by forces beyond his control, or by tragic flaws that don't diminish his essential character. Joseph Massino shattered this archetype. He demonstrated that the code was empty, that loyalty was conditional, and that when faced with real consequences, even bosses would abandon everything they claimed to stand for. There was nothing noble about his fall. He was arrested, convicted through the testimony of former associates, and then cooperated himself to reduce his sentence. He didn't go down fighting or maintaining principle to the end. He made a rational calculation about his own survival and acted accordingly. This revelation that the Godfather is ultimately just a criminal who will cooperate when convenient destroyed the mythology that had surrounded organized crime. After Massino, it became impossible to view mafia bosses as anything other than what they'd always been: criminals engaged in violence and exploitation, whose professed principles were convenient fictions that they'd abandon when maintaining them became too costly. The death of this mythology has had real consequences for organized crime. Part of the mafia's power came from its mystique, from the idea that numbers were bound by something deeper than ordinary law or ordinary loyalty. Recruits joined partly for material benefits, but also for the romance of joining something historic and meaningful. When that romance died, recruitment became much harder. Why risk everything to join an organization that offers no security, no future, and not even the consolation of belonging to something noble or meaningful? Massino's legacy, then, is the destruction of the traditional American mafia. Not just as an organization, but as an idea. He proved that Omertà was breakable, that bosses were as self-interested as anyone else, and that the codes and traditions were tools of organizational control rather than genuine principles. In doing so, he made it impossible for the Mafia to regenerate, because the cultural and psychological foundations that had sustained it were exposed as fraudulent. Whether Massino intended this effect is unclear and probably irrelevant. He cooperated to save himself, not to make philosophical statements about organized crime. But the effect of his cooperation transcended his intentions. He became symbolically important not because of what he meant to do, but because of what his actions revealed about the nature of the organization he'd led and ultimately betrayed. The title Last Godfather is thus both description and epitaph. Massino was the last of something, the last traditional boss, the last representative of an era, the last figure who could be taken seriously as a godfather in the mythological sense. And his cooperation wrote the final chapter of that mythology, ensuring that there would be no more godfathers because the idea of the godfather had been exposed as an illusion. Joseph Massino's life, examined dispassionately, offers lessons that extend beyond organized crime to broader questions about human behavior, organizational dynamics, and social structures. First, his story demonstrates the power and limits of intelligence. Massino was clearly intelligent. He rose to the top of a competitive and dangerous field through strategic thinking, careful planning, and the ability to learn from observation. His security measures showed sophisticated understanding of surveillance and investigation techniques. His management of the Bonanno family demonstrated organizational ability. But intelligence alone couldn't save him from the structural factors that ultimately destroyed his criminal enterprise. No amount of individual cleverness can overcome systematic disadvantages forever. Second, his career illustrates the nature of organizational loyalty. The Mafia's loyalty code seemed absolute, but it was actually contingent on specific conditions: reciprocity, benefit, and enforcement. When these conditions disappeared, so did the loyalty. This suggests that organizational loyalty generally depends on continued mutual benefit rather than on abstract principle. Organizations that demand loyalty while failing to provide reciprocal security and benefit will eventually face defection, regardless of their rhetoric about honor and tradition. Third, Massino's violence reveals something uncomfortable about power. Throughout history and across cultures, power has often been built on violence or its credible threat. The Mafia made this explicit. Power came from the willingness to kill and the infrastructure to carry out killings. But legitimate power structures also rest on violence, though it's mediated through law, police, and military. The difference is legitimacy and accountability, not the absence of coercion. Massino's violence was naked and unaccountable, which made it criminal. But the fundamental relationship between power and coercion exists in all organized societies. Fourth, his cooperation demonstrates the importance of incentive structures. The Witness Protection Program and reduced sentences for cooperation fundamentally changed the calculus for organized crime members. When the cost of loyalty became life imprisonment and the benefit of cooperation became freedom, rational actors chose cooperation. This shows how changing incentives can reshape behavior, even in contexts where cultural values seem firmly established. Fifth, his life trajectory shows the long-term consequences of criminal choices. The power and wealth Massino achieved through crime were temporary and ultimately meaningless. He lost everything, spent years in prison, and ended his life in hiding. The harm he caused was permanent. His victims are still dead, their families still damaged. The temporary benefits of crime were vastly outweighed by long-term costs, both to Massino and to everyone affected by his actions. Sixth, his story illustrates the evolution of criminal enterprise. The Mafia he joined in 1977 was an analog organization operating in an analog world. By the time of his arrest in 2003, technology had fundamentally altered the landscape: surveillance, communication tracking, Financial investigation all favored law enforcement. Criminal organizations that couldn't adapt to this technological shift faced extinction. This demonstrates that criminal enterprises, like legitimate businesses, must evolve with changing conditions or face obsolescence. Seventh, Massino's case shows the importance of institutional strength in combating crime. The FBI's patient investigation, prosecutors' strategic use of RICO, and the witness protection program's credibility all contributed to dismantling the Bonanno family. No single tool was sufficient. Success required sustained institutional effort using multiple approaches over decades. This suggests that complex social problems generally require sustained, multifaceted institutional responses rather than single solutions. Eighth, his cooperation reveals the fragility of codes and norms. Omertà seemed like a fundamental principle that defined the Mafia, yet it collapsed rapidly once conditions changed. This suggests that social norms, even those that seem deeply rooted, can change quickly when circumstances shift. The implications extend beyond organized crime. Any norm or tradition exists only as long as circumstances make maintaining it rational or compelling for most people. Finally, Massino's life raises questions about redemption and justice. He cooperated and received a reduced sentence, essentially trading his testimony for freedom. Was this justice? He helped convict many criminals, potentially preventing future crimes. But he'd killed people and run a criminal enterprise for decades. Can cooperation atone for such actions? Or should some crimes be beyond forgiveness, regardless of subsequent assistance to law enforcement? There are no easy answers, only competing considerations about utility, morality, and what society owes to victims versus what benefits it can extract from cooperators. These lessons don't excuse or justify Massino's life. He made choices that harmed many people and destroyed lives. He chose crime when legal alternatives existed. Even if they were less lucrative, he used violence as a business tool, treating human life as disposable when convenient. He built an organization whose primary purpose was exploitation and whose methods were criminal. No intellectual analysis of his life changes these fundamental moral facts. But understanding his life, his choices, and his eventual cooperation provides insights into human behavior, criminal organizations, and social structures that have value beyond his specific case. The lessons learned from studying organized crime have applications to understanding legitimate organizations, power dynamics, loyalty, incentive structures, and institutional effectiveness. Massino's life is a case study in the dark side of human possibility, what people are capable of when ambition, intelligence, and moral failure combine in destructive ways. The years following Joseph Massino's entry into witness protection in 2013 were marked by an eerie quiet. The man who'd once commanded one of New York's 5 families simply disappeared into American suburbia, living under an assumed name, cut off from the world he dominated. This silence, in its own way, was the perfect final chapter for a life defined by contradictions. What was Massino's life like in those final years? We can only speculate, as the specifics of his existence in witness protection remain classified. Perhaps he lived in a small house in a nondescript town far from New York, surrounded by neighbors who had no idea of his history. Maybe he watched television, read books, and contemplated the wreckage of his past. He might have maintained some contact with family members, though any such contact would have been carefully controlled and monitored to prevent his location from being discovered. The psychological experience of witness protection for someone like Massino must have been profoundly disorienting. He'd spent his entire adult life in a hierarchical organization where he commanded respect, fear, and obedience. He'd been a person of consequence, whose decisions affected lives and deaths. And then, in his final decade, he became nobody, just another elderly man living anonymously in a place he'd never chosen. dependent on government protection for his survival. Did he feel remorse for the lives he'd taken and destroyed? Or did he rationalize his actions as necessary in the context of the life he'd chosen? We can't know his private thoughts, but human psychology suggests he probably found ways to justify himself, to frame his story in terms that allowed him to live with what he'd done. Most people who commit terrible acts find psychological mechanisms to avoid overwhelming guilt. They minimize their responsibility, emphasize mitigating circumstances, or simply avoid thinking about their victims. The mundane reality of his final years stands in stark contrast to the drama of his earlier life. Instead of ordering murders and commanding criminal operations, he presumably did ordinary things, shopped for groceries, perhaps watched sports on television, managed health problems that come with age. The transformation from Godfather to anonymous, elderly man represents a fall so complete that it almost seems like a different person. In a sense, it was the identity he lived under wasn't Joseph Massino, and the life he lived bore no resemblance to his previous existence. His death in 2023 closed the book on his story, but left many questions unanswered. What did he think about his life in his final years? Did he believe his cooperation was justified? Or did he regret betraying the code he'd once sworn to uphold? Did he think about his victims, or had he successfully compartmentalized that part of his past? Would he have made different choices if he could live his life again? Or did he view his criminal career as the rational product of circumstances and opportunities? These questions matter not because Massino deserves sympathy or understanding. He doesn't. At least not in any conventional moral sense. They matter because understanding the psychology of someone who made such destructive choices helps us understand human behavior more broadly. The capacity for violence, betrayal, moral compromise, and rationalization exists in all humans. Massino didn't have these capacities because he was uniquely evil. He had them because he was human, and he cultivated and expressed them in ways that most people don't. But the underlying capacities were ordinary, which is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his story. The silence that enveloped Massino's final years was also the silence of irrelevance. The criminal world he'd known moved on without him. New criminals, new organizations, new methods emerged. The Bonanno family continued in diminished form, but under leadership that never knew Massino personally. The FBI agents who'd pursued him retired or moved on to other cases. Even in organized crime circles, where he was once a towering figure, he became a historical footnote, the boss who flipped. Remembered primarily for his betrayal rather than his achievements, this obscurity is perhaps fitting. The power and respect Massino spent decades building were always illusory to some degree. They depended on circumstances that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. When those circumstances changed, the power evaporated immediately. What remained was just an elderly man hiding from consequences of choices made decades earlier, living out his remaining time in anonymity. It was an ending that contained both justice and sadness. Justice because he faced consequences for his actions. Sadness because it revealed how empty his accomplishments had always been. Joseph Massino's death in 2023 occurred in a world where the American Mafia has become largely irrelevant. The five families still exist, but they're shadows of their former selves, unable to compete with more adaptive criminal organizations and unable to regenerate membership at rates sufficient to replace losses from arrests and aging. The structural factors that destroyed Massino's empire continue to operate against traditional organized crime. Surveillance technology becomes more sophisticated every year, making secret operations increasingly difficult. Financial tracking makes moving criminal proceeds harder. DNA evidence and forensic techniques mean that even old crimes can lead to convictions decades later. The technological arms race between law enforcement and criminals increasingly favors law enforcement, at least for traditional forms of crime, but perhaps more importantly, The social and cultural foundations that supported the mafia no longer exist. Italian-American neighborhoods that once produced recruits have dispersed. The second and third generation descendants of Italian immigrants have assimilated fully into American society, pursuing legitimate careers and having no interest in criminal enterprise. The ethnic identity that once connected mobsters to their communities has weakened to the point of irrelevance. The mystique that made mafia membership attractive has also evaporated. Movies and television shows still feature mobsters, but they're increasingly portrayed as anachronistic losers or buffoons, rather than romantic anti-heroes. The reality of FBI surveillance, RICO prosecutions, and cooperating witnesses has demolished any illusion that organized crime offers a sustainable path to success. Why risk everything to join an organization that's clearly dying? The vacuum left by the mafia's decline has been filled by other criminal enterprises. Mexican drug cartels control much of the narcotics trade in the United States, operating with efficiency and brutality that the mafia never matched. Asian organized crime groups dominate human trafficking and certain gambling operations. Russian and Eastern European criminals have cornered markets in sophisticated financial crimes and cyber offenses. These organizations learned from the mafia's failures, adopting more flexible structures and avoiding the kind of centralized hierarchy that RICO was designed to destroy. Technology has also created entirely new categories of crime that the traditional mafia is ill-equipped to exploit. Cybercrime, hacking, identity theft, ransomware, financial fraud. These require technical skills that aging mobsters don't possess and can't easily acquire. The profits from these crimes can exceed traditional rackets while carrying lower risks of violence and physical evidence. A sophisticated cyber criminal operating from abroad can steal millions with minimal risk of arrest, making traditional organized crime seem quaint by comparison. The question facing remaining mafia organizations is whether they can adapt or are doomed to extinction. Some families have attempted to modernize, recruiting younger members with technical skills and moving into new criminal markets. But they face fundamental disadvantages. Their reputations make them targets for law enforcement. Their traditional structures make them vulnerable to RICO prosecutions. And their inability to enforce Omertà means that arrests inevitably lead to cooperations and further arrests. It's possible that the American mafia will persist indefinitely in some reduced form, operating small-scale rackets and maintaining traditional activities like loan sharking and gambling. But it will never regain its former prominence. The era when organized crime meant the Italian-American mafia, when New York was divided among 5 families, when bosses commanded genuine power and respect, that era is over. Joseph Massino was the last godfather, not because no one will claim the title after him, but because the title no longer means what it once did. Looking forward, organized crime will continue to exist and evolve, but it will look increasingly unlike the traditional mafia. It will be more decentralized, more international, more technologically sophisticated, and more adaptive. The romantic image of the wise mob boss, the family structure, the codes and rituals, these will become historical curiosities rather than operational realities. Criminal enterprise will become more corporate, more ruthlessly efficient, and less bound by tradition or sentiment. This evolution represents a kind of progress, though not one that anyone should celebrate. The mafia's decline means less organized crime in traditional forms, but it doesn't mean less crime overall. It simply means that crime has evolved into forms that are harder to romanticize and harder to combat. A cyber criminal stealing identities is less dramatic than a mobster ordering a hit. But the harm caused may be greater and more widespread. Joseph Massino's legacy, then, includes accelerating the transition from traditional organized crime to its modern forms. His cooperation helped destroy the organizational structures and cultural codes that had sustained the Mafia. What replaced them may be more dangerous precisely because it's less visible, less centralized, and less vulnerable to the law enforcement techniques that proved effective against traditional organized crime. As we conclude this journey through Joseph Massino's life, we're left with the question of how his story should be remembered and what it means in the broader tapestry of American history and culture. For the victims and their families, Massino represents irredeemable evil, a murderer who destroyed lives and that escaped appropriate punishment through cooperation. From their perspective, no amount of testimony can atone for killing human beings. The fact that he died free in witness protection while their loved ones died violently and are buried in unmarked graves or were never found at all represents a profound injustice. Their memories of Massino will always be colored by pain, anger, and the sense that justice was never fully served. For law enforcement, Massino represents a significant victory in the long war against organized crime. His cooperation helped dismantle the Bonanno family and contributed to prosecutions across multiple families. His willingness to testify as a boss demonstrated that no one was beyond flipping, fundamentally changing the dynamics of organized crime. From this perspective, the deals made with cooperators like Massino, while morally uncomfortable, were necessary tools for achieving larger law enforcement goals. For the remaining members of organized crime, Massino's name is synonymous with betrayal. He violated the most sacred code of their world, and in doing so, destroyed whatever credibility that code retained. His cooperation is remembered not as an understandable response to pressure, but as the ultimate treachery, a boss who saved himself by destroying those who had been loyal to him. In mob circles, his name is likely spoken, if at all, with contempt and disgust. For historians and criminologists, Massino represents a fascinating case study in organizational dynamics, criminal enterprise, and the evolution of American organized crime. His life spans an entire era, from the Mafia's post-World War II power to its current irrelevance. His rise showed the traditional path to mob leadership, and his fall illustrated the factors that destroyed that world. His cooperation marked a turning point that accelerated changes already underway. For the general public, his story offers a window into a hidden world. Most people's knowledge of the Mafia comes from movies and television shows that romanticize and dramatize reality. Massino's actual life, his careful security measures, his methodical violence, his ultimate cooperation is less romantic but more revealing. His story shows that real organized crime is about profit, power, and survival rather than honor, family, or tradition. What should we take away from this story? Perhaps the most important lesson is that the Mafia was never what popular culture imagined it to be. The codes were always conditional, the loyalty always contingent, the honor always selective. The organization succeeded for generations not because its members were more principled than other criminals, but because circumstances, ethnic communities, law enforcement limitations, technological constraints favored their particular form of criminal enterprise. When circumstances changed, the organization collapsed with remarkable speed. The same qualities that had made it successful: centralized hierarchy, strict protocols, emphasis on loyalty, became vulnerabilities that law enforcement exploited ruthlessly. The bosses who seemed untouchable fell, the codes that seemed unbreakable broke. The empire that seemed permanent proved ephemeral. Joseph Massino's life encapsulates this entire arc. He rose through traditional means in traditional times, adapted to new challenges with intelligence and caution, achieved the highest position possible in his world, and then destroyed it all through cooperation. His story is the Mafia's story in miniature: rise, adaptation, and ultimate failure. But beyond the specifics of organized crime, Massino's life raises universal questions about human nature: loyalty, violence, power, and moral choice. How do ordinary people become capable of murder? What makes loyalty meaningful, and when does maintaining loyalty become irrational? How should society balance the competing demands of justice and utility when dealing with criminals who offer cooperation? What does success mean? And is success achieved through immoral means truly success at all? These questions don't have simple answers. They require balancing competing values and accepting uncomfortable trade-offs. Massino's life forces us to confront these complexities rather than retreating into easy moralizing. He was neither a romantic anti-hero nor a one-dimensional villain. He was a human being who made terrible choices, caused real harm, demonstrated genuine intelligence and capability, survived through adaptation and cooperation, and ultimately died peacefully while many of his victims died terribly. The discomfort we feel contemplating this disparity is appropriate. Justice in the real world is imperfect and often depends on utility rather than morality. The deals made with cooperators like Massino serve law enforcement purposes but leave moral accounts unsettled. Victims' families never get true justice. Only the satisfaction of seeing criminals in prison, and sometimes the knowledge that cooperation prevented other crimes. Memory serves important functions. We remember Joseph Massino and men like him, not to glorify them or excuse their actions, but to understand the human capacity for both evil and rationalization. We remember them to learn about criminal organizations and how to combat them. We remember them to honor victims by ensuring their suffering isn't forgotten. And we remember them as cautionary tales about the costs of choosing crime, the illusion of criminal success, and the inevitable price of violence. As the sun set on Joseph Massino's life on September 14th, 2023, it also set on an entire era of American organized crime. The world he'd inhabited for over 60 years, a world of codes and hierarchies, of violence and loyalty, of power earned through fear and maintained through intimidation, had already largely vanished. His death simply confirmed what had been true for years. The age of the traditional American godfather was over. Consider the trajectory of his life from a distance. Born in 1943 into a working-class Italian-American family, he came of age in a world where the Mafia represented a form of opportunity for young men willing to accept its costs. He made that choice, embarking on a criminal career that would span decades and ultimately lead to the highest position in his organization. Along the way, he participated in or ordered numerous murders, built a profitable criminal enterprise, survived multiple challenges to his power, and demonstrated genuine intelligence and strategic capability. Then, when faced with consequences for his actions, he violated the code he'd sworn to uphold and cooperated with the government against his former associates. This cooperation earned him a reduced sentence and entry into witness protection, where he lived his final years in anonymity. He died peacefully at 80, having escaped the death penalty or life imprisonment that his crimes might have warranted. Is this a success story? By conventional moral standards, absolutely not. Massino caused tremendous harm, destroyed lives, and ultimately escaped appropriate punishment through betrayal. The material success he achieved was temporary and meaningless. The power he wielded was illusory and unsustainable. The empire he built collapsed. Nothing he accomplished had lasting positive value. But from a purely survival-oriented perspective, Massino succeeded where many of his peers failed. He rose higher than most criminals ever do. He maintained power for over a decade. He avoided the death penalty and life imprisonment through cooperation. He died free, albeit in hiding, rather than in a prison cell or from a bullet. For someone who chose a criminal life, this might be considered a form of success. Not moral success, but survival success. This tension between moral judgment and practical assessment runs through Massino's entire story. We can condemn his choices while recognizing his intelligence. We can acknowledge the harm he caused while understanding the context in which he operated. We can criticize his betrayal of Omertà while recognizing that Omertà was itself a code designed to protect criminals from consequences. These multiple perspectives don't contradict each other. They reveal the complexity of human behavior and moral judgment. The victims of Massino's violence deserve remembrance and honor. The families destroyed by his actions deserve acknowledgement of their suffering. The communities damaged by organized crime deserve recognition of the harm inflicted upon them. Nothing in this story should minimize or excuse the real costs of Massino's criminal career. Whatever intellectual interest his life holds, whatever lessons can be extracted from his story, none of it changes the fundamental moral fact that he chose to cause harm and should be judged accordingly. But we can hold these moral judgments while also recognizing the broader historical and social significance of his life and career. Massino was the product of specific circumstances, ethnic communities, economic opportunities, both legal and illegal, criminal organizations that offered paths to power and wealth, and social structures that made crime seem rational to some individuals. Understanding these circumstances doesn't excuse his choices, but helps explain why he and many others made similar choices. His cooperation, controversial and condemned by those who value loyalty, actually reveals important truths about organizational dynamics and human behavior. Loyalty is conditional, not absolute. People maintain commitments when doing so serves their interests and abandon them when costs become too high. Codes and traditions persist only as long as circumstances make them sustainable. These lessons apply far beyond organized crime, extending to corporations, governments, and any organization that demands loyalty from its members. The technological and legal changes that destroyed Massino's empire continue to reshape criminal enterprise. Law enforcement's advantages in surveillance, communication monitoring, and forensic analysis make traditional organized crime increasingly difficult. The RICO statute provides prosecutors with powerful tools for dismantling criminal organizations. The Witness Protection Program creates incentives for cooperation that undermine Omertà and similar codes. These systemic advantages mean that traditional organized crime faces extinction, regardless of any individual's actions or qualities. What remains of the American Mafia exists largely as historical momentum, organizations that persist because they exist, not because they serve any sustainable purpose or offer viable futures for their members. The five families of New York continue nominally, but they're increasingly irrelevant to both law enforcement and the broader criminal underworld. New forms of criminal enterprise, more adaptable, more technologically sophisticated, more international, have inherited whatever market share the Mafia lost. Joseph Massino's life, then, represents both a personal story and a historical transition. As a personal story, it's the tale of a man who rose through criminal ranks, achieved power and wealth, and then lost everything through his own cooperation. As a historical transition, it's the story of organized crime's evolution from traditional, family-based structures to modern adaptive networks that bear little resemblance to the mafia of popular imagination. In the end, what we remember about Joseph Massino matters less than what we learn from his story. We learn about the nature of criminal organizations and the factors that sustain or destroy them. We learn about human psychology, moral choice, and the rationalizations that allow people to commit terrible acts. We learn about power, loyalty, violence, and betrayal. We learn about law enforcement strategies and the importance of institutional persistence in combating crime. We learn about social contexts that create opportunities for criminal enterprise and how changing those contexts can reshape criminal behavior. These lessons have value that transcends Massino's individual life. They inform policy decisions about criminal justice, help us understand organizational dynamics in both criminal and legitimate contexts, and illuminate aspects of human nature that we prefer not to acknowledge. but must understand if we hope to create just and functional societies. The story of The Last Godfather is ultimately a cautionary tale about the illusions of power, the fragility of loyalty, the inevitability of consequences, and the emptiness of success achieved through immoral means. Joseph Massino lived a life of crime for over 60 years, rose to the pinnacle of his world, and ended up with nothing of value, no legacy worth celebrating, no achievements worth emulating, no peace of mind, and no escape from the truth of what he'd done and who he'd been. And so concludes the story of Joseph Massino, the last godfather, a man who rose from the streets of Queens to command one of New York's 5 families, who survived decades of violence and treachery, only to become the very thing he once despised, an informant. His story is a reminder that in the underworld, there are no happy endings, only survivors and ghosts. From his birth in 1943 to his death in 2023, Joseph Massino lived through and participated in the rise and fall of the American Mafia. He experienced the organization at its peak power, adapted to its declining years, and ultimately accelerated its collapse through his unprecedented cooperation. His life spanned 80 years, but his significance lies not in duration, but in what his choices revealed about organized crime, human nature, and the codes that bind and fail to bind criminal organizations. The world Joseph Massino left behind in 23 is theirs little resemblance to the world he entered in 1943. The Italian-American neighborhoods that produced generations of mobsters have dispersed. The social structures that supported organized crime have weakened or disappeared. The 5 families that once dominated New York's underworld are shells of their former selves. The code of Omertà, which seemed unbreakable for generations, has been revealed as conditional and ultimately unsustainable. His legacy is complex and contradictory. He rebuilt the Bonanno family from disgrace, only to participate in its ultimate destruction. He implemented security measures that delayed but couldn't prevent his downfall. He commanded loyalty from subordinates and then betrayed them when convenient. He lived by a code for decades and then violated it to save himself. He achieved power and wealth through crime and lost everything through cooperation. For victims and their families, his cooperation couldn't restore what was taken. The men he killed remain dead. The families he destroyed remain broken. The communities he damaged still bear scars. No amount of testimony can undo the harm he caused or provide genuine justice to those who suffered because of his choices. For law enforcement, his cooperation represented a significant victory in the long struggle against organized crime. His testimony helped convict dozens of criminals and provided insights into mob operations that advanced prosecution strategies. Whether this utility justified the deals made with him is a question that each person must answer according to their own moral framework. For the remaining members of the American Mafia, his name will always be associated with the ultimate betrayal. He proved that even bosses, the supposed keepers of tradition and principle, would cooperate when facing serious consequences. This demonstration destroyed whatever remained of the mystique that had once protected and sustained La Cosa Nostra for future generations. His story serves as a historical document of a particular era in American crime. Students of criminology, sociology, and history will study his life to understand organized crime dynamics, criminal psychology, and the social context that produce and sustain criminal enterprises. His life offers lessons that extend far beyond the specifics of his individual crimes. The title Last Godfather carries with it both description and judgment. Joseph Massino was the last boss of a New York family to rise through traditional means in traditional times. He was the last to experience the Mafia when it still held genuine power and inspired real fear. He was the last to embody, even briefly, the archetype of the Godfather as popular culture imagined it. Powerful, intelligent, commanding respect and loyalty. But he was also the last because his cooperation destroyed the possibility of future godfathers in any meaningful sense. After Massino, no one could credibly claim that Omertà was sacred or that the old code still bound members. After Massino, the Godfather became a historical relic rather than a living possibility. The age he represented ended with him, not because of historical accident, but because his choices and their consequences made its continuation impossible. In the shadows where Joseph Massino once moved with power and purpose, new criminals operate with different methods and different values. They carry no tradition, honor no code, and maintain no illusions about loyalty or honor. They are ruthlessly pragmatic, technologically sophisticated, and utterly unromantic. They are the future of organized crime, and they bear no resemblance to the godfathers of the past. The era of the American Godfather ended not with violence or dramatic confrontation, but with an elderly man sitting in a witness protection home, dying peacefully in his bed, far from the city he once dominated. It ended not in glory, but in obscurity, not in loyalty, but in betrayal, not in tragedy, but in venality. Perhaps this ending is more appropriate than any dramatic alternative would have been, a reminder that the Godfather was always more mythology than reality, more fiction than truth. Joseph Massino's story is complete. The last Godfather is dead. The era he represented has passed into history. What remains are lessons, memories, and consequences. Lessons about power and loyalty, memories of victims and crimes, consequences that ripple forward through families and communities still affected by the violence of his era. Some secrets are worth keeping. Others, as Joseph Massino discovered, will destroy you if you don't reveal them. He chose revelation and survival over loyalty and principle. Whether this makes him a coward or a realist depends on your perspective. But one truth remains inarguable: in choosing to cooperate, in breaking Omertà, in becoming the first boss to inform, Joseph Massino wrote the final chapter of the traditional American Mafia's story. The book is now closed. The last Godfather is gone. The era has ended. What comes next remains to be written, but it will be written by others, in a different language, following different rules, in a world that Joseph Massino would barely recognize. His story stands as both history and warning, a testament to the rise and fall of American organized crime, and a reminder that empires built on violence and crime inevitably crumble. No matter how powerful they seem at their peak, rest in peace to the victims. May their memories outlast the criminals who destroyed them. And may the lessons of this era inform better choices, wiser policies, and more just outcomes for future generations. The story is told. The legacy is set. The judgment belongs to history. Until we meet again in the shadows of other stories, remember, loyalty without reciprocity is exploitation. Power without legitimacy is temporary. And success achieved through destruction is no success at all. The last Godfather is dead. Long live the memory of those he wronged. And may we learn from the mistakes, crimes, and failures that defined his era. This is the end of the story of Joseph Massino, not as he might have wanted it told, but as it needed to be told, complete, unflinching, and true.